Chapter 12. The Cent-Jours. The extraordinary rapidity of events during the Cent-Fours, or 100 days of Napoleon's reign in 1815, and the startling changes in the parts previously filled by the chief personages, make it difficult to consider it as an historical period. It more resembles a series of sudden theatrical transformations, only broken by the great pause while the nation waited for news from the army. The first restoration of the Bourbons had been so unexpected, and was so rapidly carried out, that the Bonapartists, or indeed all France, had hardly realized the situation before Napoleon was again in the Tuileries. And during the Cent-Jours both Bonapartists and Royalists were alike rubbing their eyes, asking whether they were awake, and wondering which was the reality and which the dream, the Empire or the Restoration. It is both difficult and interesting to attempt to follow the history of the chief characters of the period. And the reader must pardon some abrupt transitions from person to person, and from group to group. While the details of some subsequent movements of the Bonaparte family must be thrown in to give a proper idea of the strange revolution in their fortunes. We may divide the characters with which we have to deal into 5 groups: the Bonaparte family, the marshals, the statesmen of the empire, the Bourbons, and the allied monarchs. One figure and one name will be missing, but if we omit all account of poor, bleeding, mutilated France, it is but leaving her in the oblivion in which she was left at the time by every one except by Napoleon. The disaster of 1814 had rather dispersed than crushed the Bonaparte family, and they rallied immediately on the return from Elba. The final fall of the empire was total ruin to them. The provisions of the Treaty of Fontainebleau, which had been meant to ensure a maintenance to them, had not been carried out while Napoleon was still a latent power. And after 1815 the Bourbons were only too happy to find a reason for not paying a debt they had determined never to liquidate. It was well for any of the Bourbons in their days of distress to receive the bounty of the usurper, but there was a peculiar pleasure in refusing to pay the price promised for his immediate abdication. The flight of the Bonapartes in 1815 was rapid. Metternich writes to Maria Louisa in July 1815, Madame Mir and Cardinal Fesch left yesterday for Tuscany. We do not know exactly where Joseph is. Lucien is in England under a false name, Jerome in Switzerland, Louis at Rome. Queen Hortense has set out for Switzerland, whither General de Flahault and his mother will follow her. Murat seems to be still at Toulon. This, however, is not certain. Was ever such an account of a dynasty given? These had all been among the great ones of Europe. In a moment they were fugitives, several of them having for the rest of their lives a bitter struggle with poverty. Fortunately for them the Pope, the King of Holland, and the Grand Duke of Tuscany, were not under heavy obligations to Napoleon, and could thus afford to give to his family the protection denied them by those monarchs who believed themselves bound to redeem their former servility. When Napoleon landed, Maria Louisa was in Austria, and she was eager to assist in taking every precaution to prevent her son, the young King of Rome, being spirited off to join his father, whose fortune she had sworn to share. She herself was fast falling under the influence of the one-eyed Austrian general, Neipperg, just then left a widower, who was soon to be admitted to share her bed. By 1823 she seemed to have entirely forgotten the different members of the Bonaparte family, speaking of her life in France as a bad dream. She obtained the Grand Duchy of Parma, where she reigned till 1847, marrying a third time, it is said, the Count Bombelia, and dying, just too soon to be hunted from her duchy by the Revolution of 1848. There is something very touching in most that we know of the poor young King of Rome, from his childish but strangely prescient resistance to his removal from Paris to Blois on the approach of the Allies in 1814. To the message of remembrance sent in after years to the column of the Place Vendôme, his only friend in Paris. At 4 years of age Méneval describes him as gentle, but quick in answering, strong, and with excellent health. Light curly hair and ringlets set off a fresh face, while fine blue eyes lit up his regular features. He was precociously intelligent, and knew more than most children older than himself. When Méneval, the former secretary of his father, giving up his post in Austria with Maria Louisa, as he was about to rejoin Napoleon, took farewell of the prince in May 1815, the poor little motherless child drew me towards the window, and Giving me a touching look, said in a low tone, Monsieur Meva, tell him, Napoleon, that I always love him dearly. We say, motherless, because Maria Louisa seems to have yielded up her child at the dictates of policy to be closely guarded as easily as she gave up her husband. If, wrote Madame de Montesquieu, his governess, the child had a mother, I would leave him in her hands, and be happy, but she is nothing like a mother, she is more indifferent to his fate than the most utter stranger in her service. His grandfather, the Emperor Francis, to do him justice, seems to have been really kind to the lad, and while, in 1814, 1816, and in 1830, taking care to deprive him of all chance of his glorious inheritance, still seems to have cared for him personally, and to have been always kind to him. There is no truth in the story that the Austrians neglected his education and connived at the ruin of his faculties. Both his tutor, the Count Maurice Dietrich Stein, and Marshal Marmont, who conversed with him in 1831, agree in speaking highly of him as full of promise, Marmont's evidence being especially valuable as showing that the Austrians did not object to the Duke of Reichstadt, as he had been created by his grandfather in 1818. Learning all he could of his father's life from one of the marshals. In 1831 Marmont describes him, I recognized his father's look in him, and in that he most resembled Napoleon. His eyes, not so large as those of Napoleon, and sunk deeper in their sockets, had the same expression, the same fire, the same energy. His forehead was like that of his father, and so was the lower part of his face and his chin. Then his complexion was that of Napoleon in his youth, with the same pallor and the same color of the skin, but all the rest of his face recalled his mother in the House of Austria. He was taller than Napoleon by about 3 inches. As long as the Duke lived his name was naturally the rallying point of the Bonapartes, and was mentioned in some of the many conspiracies against the Bourbons. In 1830 Joseph Bonaparte tried to get the sanction of the Austrians to his nephew being put forward as a claimant to the throne of France, vacant by the flight of Charles X, but they held their captive firmly. A very interesting passage is given in the Memoirs of Charles Greville, who says that Prince Esterhazy told him a great deal about the Duke of Reichstadt, who, if he had lived, would have probably played a great part in the world. He died of a premature decay, brought on, apparently, by overexertion and overexcitement. His talents were very conspicuous, he was pétri d'ambition, worshipped the memory of his father, and for that reason never liked his mother. His thoughts were incessantly turned towards France, and when he heard of the days of July, overthrow of Charles X, he said, why was I not there to take my chance? He evinced great affection and gratitude to his grandfather, who, while he scrupulously observed all his obligations towards Louis Philippe, could not help feeling a secret pride in the aspiring genius of Napoleon's son. He was well educated, and day and night pored over the history of his father's glorious career. He delighted in military exercises, and not only shone at the head of his regiment, but had already acquired the hereditary art of ingratiating himself with the soldiers. Esterhazy went on to describe how the Duke abandoned everything at a ball when he met their marshals Marmont and Maison. He had no eyes or ears but for them. From 9 in the evening to 5 the next morning he devoted himself to these marshals. There was the true Napoleonic ring in his answer to advice given by Marmont when the Duke said that he would not allow himself to be put forward by the sovereigns of Europe. The son of Napoleon should be too great to serve as an instrument. And in events of that nature I wish not to be an advanced guard, but a reserve, that is, to come as a succor, recalling great memories. His death in 1832, on the 22d of July, the anniversary of the Battle of Salamanca, solved many questions. Metternich visited the Duke on his deathbed. It was a heartrending sight. I never remember to have seen a more mournful picture of decay. When Francis was told of the death of his grandson he answered, I look upon the Duke's death as a blessing for him. Whether it be detrimental or otherwise to the public good I do not know. As for myself, I shall ever lament the loss of my grandson. Josephine was in her grave at Rouen when Napoleon returned. She had died on the 29th of May, 1814, at Malmaison, while the Allies were exhibiting themselves in Paris. It seems hard that she should not have lived to enjoy a triumph, however brief, over her Austrian rival. She, at least, said Napoleon truly, would never have abandoned me. Josephine's daughter, Hortense, separated from her husband, Louis Bonaparte, and created Duchess of St. Louis by Louis XVIII. Was in Paris, much suspected by the Bourbons, but really engaged in a lawsuit with her husband about the custody of her sons. She had to go into hiding when the news of the landing arrived, but her empty house, left unwatched, became very useful for receiving the Bonapartists, who wished for a place of concealment, amongst them, as we shall see, being, of all people, Fouché. Hortense was met by Napoleon with some reproaches for accepting a title from the Bourbons, but she did the honors of the Élysée for him, and it is creditable to both of them that, braving the vile slanders about their intercourse, she was with him to the end. And that one of the last persons to embrace him at Malmaison before he started for the coast was his adopted daughter, the child of his discarded wife. Hortense's presence in Paris was thought to be too dangerous by the Prussian governor, and she was peremptorily ordered to leave. An appeal to the Emperor Francis received a favorable answer, but Francis always gave way where any act against his son-in-law was in question, and she had to start at the shortest notice on a wandering life to Aix, Baden, and Constance, till the generosity of the small but brave canton of Thegau enabled her to get a resting place at the chateau of Arenenburg. In 1831 she lost her second son, the eldest then surviving, who died from fever in a revolutionary attempt in which he and his younger brother, the future Napoleon III, were engaged. She was able to visit France incognito, and even to see Louis Philippe and his queen, but her presence in the country was soon thought dangerous, and she was urged to leave. In 1836 Hortense's last child, Louis Napoleon, made his attempt at an émule at Strasbourg, and was shipped off to America by the government. She went to France to plead for him, and then, worn out by grief and anxiety, returned to Arenenburg, which her son, the future emperor, only succeeded in reaching in time to see her die in October 1837. She was laid with Josephine at Rouen. Hortense's brother, Prince Eugene, the Viceroy of Italy, was at Vienna when Napoleon returned, and fell under the suspicion of the Allies of having informed the emperor of the intention of removing him from Elba. He was detained in Bavaria by his father-in-law the king, to whose court he retired, and who in 1817 created him Duke of Leuchtenberg and Prince of Eichstätt. With the protection of Bavaria he actually succeeded in wringing from the Bourbons some 700,000 francs of the property of his mother. A first attack of apoplexy struck him in 1823, and he died from a second in February 1824 at Munich. His descendants have intermarried into the royal families of Portugal, Sweden, Brazil, Russia, and Württemberg. His grandson now, 1884, holds the title of Leuchtenberg. Except Louis, an invalid, all the brothers of the emperor were around him in the cent-jours, the supreme effort of their family. Joseph had left Spain after Vittoria, and had remained in an uncomfortable and unrecognized state near Paris until in 1814 he was again employed, and when, rightly or not, he urged the retreat of the regency from Paris to Blois. He then took refuge at his chateau of Prangins in the Canton Vaud in Switzerland, closely watched by the Bourbonists, who dreaded danger from every side except the real point, and who preferred trying to hunt the Bonapartists from place to place, instead of making their life bearable by carrying out the engagements with them. In 1816, escaping from the arrest with which he was threatened, after having written to urge Murat to action with fatal effect, Joseph joined Napoleon in Paris, and appeared at the Champ de Mai, sitting also in the Chamber of Peers, but, as before, putting forward ridiculous pretensions as to his inherent right to the peerage, and claiming a special seat. In fact, he never could realize how entirely he owed any position to the brother he wished to treat as an equal. He remained in Paris during the brief campaign, and after Waterloo was concealed in the house of the Swedish ambassador, where his sister-in-law, the Crown Princess of Sweden, the wife of Bernadotte, was living. Muffling, the Prussian governor of Paris, wished to arrest him, but as the governor could not violate the domicile of an ambassador, he had to apply to the Tsar, who arranged for the escape of the ex-king before the governor could seize him. Joseph went to the coast, pretty much following the route of Napoleon. He was arrested once at Saintes, but was allowed to proceed, and he met his brother on the 4th of July, at Rochefort. It is significant as to the possibility of the escape of Napoleon that Joseph succeeded in getting on the brig Commerce as M. Bouchard, and, though the ship was thrice searched by the English, he got to New York on the 28th of August, where he was mistaken for Carnot. He was well received, and, taking the title of Comte de Survilliers, he first lived at Lansdowne, Fairmount Park, Philadelphia, where he afterwards always passed part of the year while he was in America. He also bought the property of Point Breeze, at Bordentown, on the Delaware, where he built a house with a fine view of the river. This first house was burnt down, but he erected another, where he lived in some state and in great comfort, displaying his jewels and pictures to his admiring neighbors, and showing kindness to impecunious nephews. The news of the Revolution of July in 1830, which drove Charles X from the throne, excited Joseph's hopes for the family of which he considered himself the regent, and he applied to Metternich to get the Austrian government to allow or assist in the placing his nephew, the Duke of Reichstadt, on the throne of France. Austria would not even answer. In July 1832 Joseph crossed to England, where he met Lucien, just arrived from Italy, bringing the news of the death of his nephew. Disappointed, he stayed in England for some time, but returned to America in 1836. He finally left America, and again came to England, where he had a paralytic stroke, and in 1843 he went to Florence, where he met his wife after a long separation. Joseph lived long enough to see the two attempts of another nephew, Louis Napoleon, at Strasbourg in 1836, and at Boulogne in 1840, which seem to have been undertaken without his knowledge, and to have much surprised him. He died in Florence in 1844, his body was buried first in Santa Croce, Florence, but was removed to the Invalids in 1864. His wife the ex-queen, had retired in 1815 to Frankfurt and to Brussels, where she was well received by the king, William, and where she stayed till 1823, when she went to Florence, dying there in 1845. Her monument is in the Cappella Riccardi, Santa Croce, Florence. Lucien had retired to Rome in 1804, on the creation of the empire, and had continued embroiled with his brother, partly from his so-called republican principles, but chiefly from his adhering to his marriage, his second one, with Madame Juberthon. A union which Napoleon steadily refused to acknowledge, offering Lucien anything, a kingdom or the hand of a queen, if we take Lucien's account, if he would only consent to the annulment of the contract. In August 1810, affecting uneasiness as Napoleon stretched his power over Rome, Lucien embarked for America, but he was captured by the English and taken, first to Malta and then to England, where he passed the years till 1814 in a sort of honorable captivity, first at Ludlow and then at Thorngrove, not far from that town. In 1814 Lucien was released, when he went to Rome, where he was welcomed by the kindly old Pope, who remembered the benefits conferred by Napoleon on the Church, while he forgot the injuries personal to himself. And the stiff-necked Republican, the one-time Brutus Bonaparte, accepted the title of Duke of Musignano and Prince of Canino. In 1815 Lucien joined his brother, whom he wished to abdicate at the Champ de Mai in favor of the King of Rome, placing his sword only at the disposal of France. This step was seriously debated, but, though it might have placed the Allies in a more difficult position, it would certainly have been disregarded by them, at least unless some great victory had given the dynasty firmer footing. After Waterloo he was in favor of a dissolution of the Chambers, but Napoleon had become hopeless and almost apathetic, while Lucien himself, from his former connection with the 18th and 19th Brumaire, was looked on with great distrust by the Chambers, as indeed he was by his brother. Advantage was taken of his Roman title to taunt him with not being a Frenchman, and all his efforts failed. At the end he fled, and failing to cross to England or to get to Rochefort, he reached Turin on the 12th of July only to find himself arrested. He remained there till the 15th of September, when he was allowed to go to Rome. There he was interned and carefully watched. Indeed in 1817 the Pope had to intervene to prevent his removal to the north of Germany, so anxious were the Allies as to the safety of the puppet they had put on the throne of France. The death of Napoleon in 1821 released Lucien and the Bonaparte family from the constant surveillance exercised over them till then. In 1830 he bought a property, the Croce del Biacco, near Bologna. The flight of the elder branch of the Bourbons from France in 1830 raised his hopes, and, as already said, he went to England in 1832 to meet Joseph and to plan some step for raising Napoleon II to the throne. The news of the death of his nephew dashed all the hopes of the family, and after staying in England for some time he returned to Italy, dying at Viterbo in 1840, and being buried at Canino, where also his second wife lies. Lucien had a taste for literature, and was the author of several works, which a kindly posterity will allow to die. Louis Bonaparte had fled from his kingdom of Holland in 1810, after a short reign of 4 years, disgusted with being expected to study the interests of the brother to whom he owed his throne, and with being required to treat his wife Hortense with ordinary consideration. He had taken refuge in Austria, putting that court in great anxiety how to pay him the amount of attention to be expected by the brother of the emperor, and at the same time the proper coldness Napoleon might wish shown to a royal deserter. Thanks to the suggestions of Metternich, they seem to have been successful in this task. Taking the title of Comte de Saint-Lin from an estate in France, Louis went first to Toplitz, then to Graz, and in 1813 he took refuge in Switzerland. In 1814 he went to Rome, and then to Florence, where the Grand Duke Ferdinand received any of the family who came there with great kindness. Louis was the least interesting of the family, and it is difficult to excuse his absence from France in 1815. After all, the present of a kingdom is not such an unpardonable offense as to separate brothers forever, and Napoleon seems to have felt deeply the way in which he was treated by a brother to whom he had acted as a father. Still, ill health and the natural selfishness of invalids may account for much. While his son Louis Napoleon was flying about making his attempts on France, Louis remained in the Roman palace of the French Academy, sunk in anxiety about his religious state. He disclaimed his son's proceedings, but this may have been due to the Pope, who sheltered him. Anyhow, it is strange to mark the difference between the father and his 2 sons who came of age, and who took to revolution so kindly. In 1846 Louis was ill at Leghorn when his son escaped from Ham, where he had been imprisoned after his Boulogne attempt. Passports were refused to the son to go from Italy to his father, and Louis died alone on the 25th of July, 1846. He was buried at Santa Croce, Florence, but the body was afterwards removed to the village church of St. Lou Taverny, rebuilt by his son Napoleon III. Jerome, the youngest of the whole family, the Pmidi, as Napoleon liked to call him, had been placed in the navy, in which profession he passed as having distinguished himself, after leaving his admiral in rather a peculiar manner, by attacking an English convoy, and eventually escaping the English by running into the port of Concarneau, believed to be inaccessible. At that time it was an event for a French man-of-war to reach home. Jerome had incurred the anger of Napoleon by marrying a beautiful young lady of Baltimore, Amika Patterson, but, more obedient than Lucien, he submitted to have this marriage annulled by his all-powerful brother. And in reward he received the brand new kingdom of Westphalia, and the hand of a daughter of the King of Württemberg, the cleverest king in Europe, according to Napoleon. Jerome is said to have ruled rather more as a Heliogabalus than a Solomon, but the new kingdom had the advantage of starting with good administrators, and with the example of the Code. In 1812 Jerome was given the command of the right wing of the Grand Army in its advance against Russia, but he did not fulfill the expectations of his brother, and Davoust took the command instead. Every king feels himself a born general, whatever else they cannot do. War is an art which comes with the crown, and Jerome, unwilling to serve under a mere marshal, withdrew in disgust. In 1813 he had the good feeling and the good sense to refuse the treacherous offer of the Allies to allow him to retain his kingdom if he joined them against his brother, a snare his sister Caroline fell into at Naples. On the downfall of Napoleon, Jerome, as the Count of Gratz, went to Switzerland, and then to Gratz and Trieste. His wife, the ex-Queen Catherine, fell into the hands of Maubreuil, the officer sent on a mysterious mission, believed to be intended for the murder of Napoleon, but which only resulted in the robbery of the Queen's jewels and of some 80. 000 francs. The jewels were for the most part recovered, being fished up from the bed of the Seine, but not the cash. In 1815 Jerome joined his brother, and appeared at the Champ de Mai. A true Bonaparte, his vanity was much hurt, however, by having, he, a real king, to sit on the back seat of the carriage, while his elder brother Lucien, a mere Roman prince, occupied a seat of honor by the side of Napoleon. In the Waterloo campaign he was given the 6th Division, forming part of Rieu's corps, General Guilleminot being sent with him to prevent any of the awkwardnesses of 1812. His division was engaged with the Prussians on the 15th of June, and at Quatre-Bras he was severely wounded. At Waterloo his division formed the extreme left of the French infantry, opposite Hougoumont, and was engaged in the struggle for that post. Whatever his failings may have been, he is acknowledged to have fought gallantly. After the battle he was given the command of the army by his brother, and was told to cover the retreat to Laon, which he reached on the 21st of June, with 18,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and 2 batteries which he had rallied. This, be it observed, is a larger force than Ney told the Chambers even Grouchy, none of whose men are included, could have, and Jerome's strength had swollen to 25,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry when he handed over the army to Soult at Laon. Napoleon had intended to leave Jerome with the command of the army, but he eventually took him to Paris. When Napoleon left the country Jerome was assured by the ambassador of Württemberg that he would find a refuge in the dominions of his father-in-law. But when he arrived there he was informed that if he did not wish to be, according to the original intentions of the Allies, handed over to the Prussians, and separated from his wife, he must sign an engagement to remain in Württemberg under strict surveillance. He was then imprisoned at Göppingen, and afterwards at Ellwangen, where he was not even allowed to write or receive letters except through the captain of the chateau. Part of Jerome's troubles came from the conduct of his wife Catherine, who had the idea that, as she had been given in marriage by her father to Jerome, as she had lived for 7 years as his wife, and as she had borne a child to him, she was really his wife, and bound to remain with him in his misfortunes. The royal family of Württemberg, however, following the illustrious example of that of Austria, looked on her past life as a mere state of concubinage, useful to the family, and to be respected while her husband could retain his kingdom, but which should end the moment there was nothing more to be gained from Napoleon or his brother. It was all proper and decorous to retain the title of King of Württemberg, which the former Duke and then Elector had owed to the exile of St. Helena, but King Frederick, and still less his son William, who succeeded him in 1816, could not comprehend Catherine's clinging to her husband when he had lost his kingdom. "I was a queen. I am still a wife and mother," wrote the princess to her disgusted father. Another complaint against this extraordinary princess was that she actually saw Las Cases on his return from St. Helena, and thus obtained news of the exile. After constant ill-treatment Jerome and his wife, as the Count and Countess of Montfort, a rank the King of Württemberg afterwards raised to prince, were allowed to proceed to Hainburg near Vienna, then to Florence, and, later to Trieste, where Jerome was when his sister Elisa died. In 1823 they were permitted to go to Rome, and in 1835 they went to Lausanne, where his true-hearted wife died the same year. Jerome went to Florence, and lived to see the revival of the empire, and to once more enjoy the rank of a French prince. He died in 1860 at the Château of Villagines in France, and was buried in the Invalides. The mother of the emperor, Laetitia, in 1814, had retained her title of Imperatrice Mère, and had retired to Rome. She then went to Elba in June, and stayed there with her daughter Pauline until Napoleon had sailed for France. On 2 March 1814 she went from Elba to San Vincenzo near Leghorn, and then to Rome. Her son sent a frigate for her, the Thermopylae, which was captured by the English Rivoli. Another vessel, the Dryade, brought her to France, and she joined Napoleon in Paris. We must have a regard for this simple old lady, who was always careful and saving, only half believing in the stability of the empire, and, like a true mother, always most attentive to the most unfortunate of her children. Her life had been full of startling changes, and it must have been strange for the woman who had been hunted out of Corsica, flying from her house just in time to save her life from the adherents of Paoli, to find herself in grandeur in Paris. She saw her son just before he left, as she thought, for America, and then retired to the Rinuccini, now the Bonaparte Palace at Rome, where she died in 1836. She had been anxious to join Napoleon at St. Helena, and had refused, as long as Napoleon was alive, to forgive her daughter Caroline, the wife of Murat, for her abandonment of her brother. She was buried at Albano. Letitia's youngest daughter, the beautiful but frail Pauline, Duchess of Guastalla, married first to General Leclerc, and then to Prince Camille Bourgel, was at Nice when her brother abdicated in 1814. She retired with her mother to Rome, and in October 1814 went to Elba, staying there till Napoleon left, except when she was sent to Naples with a message of forgiveness for Murat. There was a characteristic scene between her and Colonel Campbell when the English commissioner arrived to find Napoleon gone. Pauline professed ignorance till the last of her brother's intentions, and pressed the colonel's hand to her heart that he might feel how agitated she was. She did not appear to be so, says the battered old colonel, who seems to have been proof against her charms. She then went to Rome, and later to Pisa. Her health was failing, and, unable to join her brother in France, she sent him her only means of assistance, her jewels, which were captured at Waterloo. Her offer to go to St. Helena, repeated several times, was never accepted by Napoleon. She died in 1825 at Florence, from consumption, reconciled to her husband, from whom she had been separated since 1807. She was buried at Sta Maria Maggiore, Rome. Elisa, the eldest sister of Napoleon, the former Grand Duchess of Tuscany, which duchy she had ruled well, being a woman of considerable talent, was the first of all to die. In 1814 she had been forced to fly from her government, and, accompanied by her husband, she had attempted to reach France. Finding herself cut off by the Austrians, she took shelter with Augereau's army, and then returned to Italy. She took the title of Comtesse de Campagnana, and retired to Trieste, near which town, at the Château of Saint Andrea, under a wearisome surveillance, she expired in 1820, watched by her husband, Felix Bicciacci, and her sister Caroline. Her monument is in the Bacciacci Chapel in San Petronio, Bologna. Caroline, the wife of Murat, was the only one of the family untrue to Napoleon. Very ambitious, and forgetting how completely she owed her kingdom of Naples to her brother, she had urged Murat in 1814 to separate from Napoleon, and, still worse, to attack Eugene, who held the north of Italy against the Austrians. She relied on the formal treaty with Austria that Murat should retain his kingdom of Naples, and she may also have trusted to the good offices of her former admirer Metternich. When the Congress of Vienna met, the French minister, Talleyrand, at once began to press for the removal of Murat. A trifling treaty was not considered an obstacle to the heaven-sent deliverers of Europe, and Murat, believing his fate sealed, hearing of Napoleon's landing, and urged on by a misleading letter from Joseph Bonaparte, at once marched to attack the Austrians. He was easily routed by the Austrians under Neipperg, the future husband of Maria Louisa. Murat fled to France, and Caroline first took refuge in an English man-of-war, the Tremendous, being promised a free passage to England. She was, however, handed over to the Austrians, who kept her in confinement at Hainburg near Vienna. In October 1815 Murat landed in Calabria in a last wild attempt to recover his throne. He was arrested and immediately shot. After his murder Caroline, taking the title of Countess of Lapona, an anagram of Napoli, was permitted to retire to Trieste with Elisa, Jerome, and his wife. Caroline was almost without means of existence, the Neapolitan Bourbons refusing even to give up the property she had brought there. She married a General MacDonald. When Hortense was buried at Rouen, Caroline obtained permission to attend the sad ceremony. In 1838 she went to France to try to obtain a pension, and succeeded in getting one of 100,000 francs. She died from cancer in the stomach in 1839, and was buried in the Campo Santo, Bologna. Cardinal Fesch, the half-uncle of Napoleon, the Archbishop of Lyons, who had fallen into disgrace with Napoleon for taking the side of the Pope and refusing to accept the See of Paris, to which he was nominated by Napoleon. Had retired to Rome in 1814, where he remained till the return of Napoleon, when he went to Paris, and accepted a peerage. After Waterloo he again sought the protection of the Pope, and he remained at Rome till his death in 1839, a few days before Caroline Bonaparte's. He was buried in S. Lorenzo in Lucina, Rome. He had for years been a great collector of pictures, of which he left a large number, 1,200, to the town of Ajaccio. The cardinal, buying at the right time when few men had either enough leisure or money to think of pictures, got together a most valuable collection. This was sold in 1843–44 at Rome. Its contents now form some of the greatest treasures in the galleries of Dudley House and of the Marquis of Hertford, now Sir Richard Wallace's. In a large collection there are generally some daubs, but it is an amusing instance of party spirit to find the value of his pictures run down by men who are unwilling to allow anyone connected with Napoleon to have even taste in art. He always refused the demands of the Restoration that he should resign his See of Lyons, though under Louis Philippe he offered to do so, and leave his pictures to France. If the Bonaparte family were allowed to enter France, this was refused. It can hardly be denied that the fate of the Bonapartes was a hard one. Napoleon had been undisputed sovereign of France for 14 years, Louis had been king of Holland for 4 years, Jerome was king of Westphalia for 6 years, Caroline was queen of Naples for 7 years. If Napoleon had forfeited all his rights by leaving Elba after the conditions of his abdication had been broken by the Allies, still there was no reason why the terms stipulated for the other members of the family should not have been carried out. Or at least an ordinary income insured to them. With all Napoleon's faults he was always ready to shower wealth on the victims of his policy. The sovereigns of the continent had courted and intermarried with the Bonapartes in the fame of that family's grandeur. There was neither generosity nor wisdom in treating them as so many criminals the moment fortune had declared against them. The conduct of the Allies was not influenced simply by the principle of legitimacy, for the King of Saxony only kept his throne by the monarchs falling out over the spoil. If sovereigns were to be respected as of divine appointment, it was not well to make their existence only depend on the fate of war. Nothing in the history of the Cent-Jours is more strange than the small part played in it by the marshals, the very men who are so identified in our minds with the emperor. That we might have expected to find that brilliant band playing a most prominent part in his last great struggle, no longer for mere victory, but for very existence. In recording how the Guard came up the fatal hill at Waterloo for their last combat, it would seem but natural to have to give a long roll of the old historic names as leading or at least accompanying them. And the reader is apt to ask, where were the men whose very titles recalled such glorious battlefields, such achievements, and such rewards showered down by the man who, almost alone at the end of the day, rode forward to invite that death from which it was such cruel kindness to save him? Only 3 marshals were in Belgium in 1815, and even of them one did but count his promotion from that very year. So it is but natural for French writers to dream of what might have been the course of the battle if Murat's plume had waved with the cavalry, if Mortier had been with the Guard, and if Davoust or one of his tried brethren had taken the place of Grouchy. There is, however, little real ground for surprise at this absence of the marshals. Death, time, and hardships had all done their work amongst that grand array of commanders. Some were old men, veterans of the Revolutionary Wars, when first created marshals in 1804, others, such as Massena, were now but the wreck of themselves. And even before 1812 Napoleon had been struck with the failing energy of some of his original companions. Indeed, it might have been better for him if he had in 1813, as he half resolved, cast away his dislike to new faces, and fought his last desperate campaigns with younger men who still had fortunes to win, leaving Berthier to hunt at Grosbois, and the other marshals to enjoy their well-deserved rest in their splendid hotels at Paris. Davoust, Duke of Auerstad, Prince of Eckmühl, whose name should be properly spelt Davout, was one of the principal personages at the end of the Cent-Jours. Strict and severe, having his corps always in good order, and displaying more character than most of the military men under Napoleon, one is apt to believe that the conqueror at Auerstadt bade fair to be the most prominent of all the marshals. In 1814 he had returned from defending Hamburg to find himself under a cloud of accusations, and the Bourbons ungenerously and unwisely left him undefended for acts which they must have known were part of his duty as governor of a besieged place. At the time he was attacked as if his first duty was not to hold the place for France, but to organize a system of outdoor relief for the neighboring population, and to surrender as soon as he had exhausted the money in the government chest and the provisions in the government stores. Sore and discontented, practically proscribed, still Davoust would not join in the too hasty enterprise of the brothers Lallemand, who wished him to lead the military rising on the approach of Napoleon. But he was with the emperor on the day after his arrival in Paris. Davoust might have expected high command in the army, but, to his annoyance, Napoleon fixed on him as war minister. For several years the war minister had been little more than a clerk, and neither had nor was expected to have much influence with the army. Napoleon now wanted a man of tried devotion, and of stern enough character to overawe the capital and the restless spirits in the army. Much against his will Davoust was therefore forced to content himself with the organization of the forces being hastily raised, but he chafed in his position. And it is characteristic of him that Napoleon was eventually forced to send him the most formal orders before the surly minister would carry out the emperor's unlucky intention of giving a command to Bourmont, whom Davoust strongly and rightly suspected of treachery. When Napoleon left the capital Davoust became its governor, and held his post unmoved by the intrigues of the Republicans and the Royalists. When Napoleon returned from the great disaster Davoust gave his voice for the only wise policy, resistance and the prorogation of the factious chambers. On the abdication of Napoleon the provisional government necessarily gave Davoust the command of the army which was concentrated round Paris. If Davoust had restricted himself less closely to his duty as a soldier, if he had taken more on himself, with the 100,000 men he soon had under him, he might have saved France from much of her subsequent humiliation. Or at least he might have preserved the lives of Ney and of the brave men whom the Bourbons afterwards butchered. Outwitted by Fouché, and unwilling to face the hostility of the Chambers, Davoust at last consented to the capitulation of Paris, though he first gave the Prussian cavalry a sharp lesson. While many of his comrades were engaged in the great struggle for favor or safety, the stern marshal gave up his ministry, and, doing the last service in his power to France, stopped all further useless bloodshed by withdrawing the army. No easy task in their then humor, behind the lawyer, where he kept what the Royalists called the brigands of the lawyer, in subjection till relieved by MacDonald. He was the only one of the younger marshals who had not been tried in Spain, and so far he was fortunate. But, though he was not popular with the army, his character and services seemed to point him out as the most fit of all the marshals for an independent command. Had Napoleon been successful in 1812, Davoust was to have received the viceroyalty of Poland, and he would probably have left a higher name in history than the other men placed by Napoleon to rule over his outlying kingdoms. In any case it was fortunate for France and for the Allies that a man of his character ruled the army after Napoleon abdicated. There would otherwise have been wild work round Paris, as it was only with the greatest difficulty and by the force of his authority and example that Davoust succeeded in getting the army to withdraw from the capital, and to gradually adopt the white cockade. When superseded by MacDonald he had done a work no other man could have accomplished. He protested against the proscription, but it was too late, his power had departed. In 1819 he was forgiven for his services to France, and was made a peer, but he died in 1823, only 53 years old. Among the marshals who gave an active support to Napoleon, Ney takes the leading part in most eyes. If it were only for his fate, which is too well known for much to be said here concerning it. In 1815 Ney was commanding in Franche-Comté, and was called up to Paris and ordered to go to Besançon to march so as to take Napoleon in flank. He started off, not improbably using the rough brags afterwards attributed to him as most grievous sins, such as that he would bring back Napoleon in an iron cage. It had been intended to have sent the Duc de Berry, the second son of the Comte d'Artois, with Ney, and it was most unfortunate for the marshal that this was not done. There can be no possible doubt that Ney spoke and acted in good faith when he left Paris. One point alone seems decisive of this. Ney found under him in command, as general of division, Bourmont, an officer of well-known royalist opinions, who had at one time served with the Vendéan insurgents, and who afterwards deserted Napoleon just before Waterloo. Although he had entreated to be employed in the campaign. Not only did Ney leave Bourmont in command, but, requiring another divisional general, instead of selecting a Bonapartist, he urged Lecourbe to leave his retirement and join him. Now, though Lecourbe was a distinguished general, specially famed for mountain warfare, witness his services in 1799 among the Alps above Lucerne, he had been long left unemployed by Napoleon on account of his strong republican opinions and his sympathy with Moreau. These two generals, Bourmont and Lecourbe, the two arms of Ney as commander, through whom alone he could communicate with the troops, he not only kept with him, but consulted to the last, before he declared for Napoleon. This would have been too dangerous a thing for a tricky politician to have attempted as a blind, but Ney was well known to be only too frank and impulsive. Had the Duc de Berry gone with him, had Ney carried with him such a gauge of the intention of the Bourbons to defend their throne, it is probable that he would have behaved like MacDonald, and it is certain that he would have had no better success. The Bonapartists themselves dreaded what they called the wrong-headedness of Ney. It was, however, thought better to keep the Duc de Berry in safety. Ney found himself put forward singly, as it were, to oppose the man whom all France was joining. He found, as did every officer sent on a similar mission, that the soldiers were simply waiting to meet Napoleon. And while the princes sought security, while the soldiers plotted against their leaders, came the calls of the emperor in the old trumpet tone. The eagle was to fly, nay, it was flying from tower to tower, and victory was advancing with a rush. Was Ney to be the one man to shoot down his old leader? Could he, as he asked, stop the sea with his hands? On his trial his subordinate, Bourmont, who had by that time shown his devotion to the Bourbons by sacrificing his military honor, and deserting to the Allies, was asked whether Ney could have got the soldiers to act against the emperor. He could only suggest that if Ney had taken a musket and himself charged, the men would have followed his example. Still, said Bourmont, I would not dare to affirm that he, the marshal, would have won. And who was Ney to charge? We know how Napoleon approached the forces sent to oppose him. He showed himself alone in the front of his own troops. Was Ney to deliberately kill his old commander? Was any general ever expected to undergo such a test? And can it be believed that the soldiers who carried off the reluctant Huguenot and chased the flying MacDonald, had such a reverence for the Rougeau, as they called him, that they would have stood by while he committed this murder? The whole idea is absurd, as Ney himself said at his trial, they would have pulverized him. Undoubtedly the honorable course for Ney would have been to have left his corps when he lost control over them. But to urge, as was done afterwards, that he had acted on a preconceived scheme, and that his example had such weight, was only malicious falsehood. The emperor himself knew well how little he owed to the free will of his marshal, and he soon had to send him from Paris, as Ney, sore at heart and discontented with himself and with both sides, uttered his mind with his usual freedom. Ney was first ordered to inspect the frontier from Dunkirk to Bâle, and was then allowed to go to his home. He kept so aloof from Napoleon that when he appeared on the Champ de Mai the emperor affected surprise, saying that he thought Ney had emigrated. At the last moment Marshal Mortier fell ill. Ney had already been sent for. He hurried up, buying Mortier's horses, presumably the ill-fated animals who died under him at Waterloo, and reached the army just in time to be given the command of the left wing. It has been well remarked that the very qualities which made Ney invaluable for defense or for the service of a rearguard weighed against him in such a combat as Quatre Bras. Splendid as a corps leader, he had not the commander's eye to embrace the field and surmise the strength of the enemy at a glance. At Bautzen in 1818 his staff had been unable to prevent him from leaving the route which would have brought him on the very rear of the enemy, because seeing the foe, and unable to resist the desire of returning their fire, he turned off to engage immediately. At Quatre Bras, not seeing the force he was engaged with, believing he had the whole English army on his hands from the first, he let himself at the beginning of the day be imposed upon by a mere screen of troops. We cannot here go into Ney's behavior at Waterloo except to point out that too little importance is generally given to the fact of the English cavalry having, in a happy moment, fallen on and destroyed the artillery which was being brought up to sweep the English squares at close quarters. At Waterloo, as in so many other combats, the account of Ney's behavior more resembles that of a Homeric hero than of a modern general. To the ideal commander of today, watching the fight at a distance, calmly weighing its course, undisturbed except by distant random shots, it is strange to compare Ney staggering through the gate of Königsberg all covered with blood, smoke and snow, musket in hand, announcing himself as the rearguard of France, or appearing, a second Achilles, on the ramparts of Smolensk to encourage the yielding troops on the glacis, or amidst the flying troops at Waterloo. With uncovered head and broken sword, black with powder, on foot, his fifth horse killed under him, knowing that life, honor, and country were lost, still hoping against hope and attempting one more last desperate rally. If he had died, ah! If he had died there, what a glorious tomb might have risen, glorious for France as well as for him, with the simple inscription, "The bravest of the brave." Early on the June 19th a small band of officers retreating from the field found Ney asleep at Marchiennes, the first repose he had had for 4 days, and they did not disturb him for orders. And indeed what order could Marshal Ney have given? The disaster of the day, the overwhelming horror of the flight of the beaten army, simply crushed Ney morally as well as physically. Rising in the chambers he denounced all attempt at further resistance. He did not know, he would not believe, that Grouchy was safe, and that the army was fast rallying. Fresh from the field, with all its traces on him, the authority of Ney was too great for the government. Frightened friends, plotting royalists, echoed the wild words of Ney brave only against physical dangers. Instead of dying on the battlefield, he had lived to ensure the return of the Bourbons, the fall of Bonaparte, his own death, and the ruin of France. Before his exception from the amnesty was known Ney left Paris on the 6th of July, and went into the country with but little attempt at concealment, and with formal passports from Fouché. The capitulation of Paris seemed to cover him, and he was so little aware of the thirst of the royalists for his blood that he let his presence be known by leaving about a splendid sabre presented to him by the emperor on his marriage, and recognized by mere report by an old soldier as belonging to Ney or Murat. And Ney himself led into the house the party sent to arrest him on the 5th of August, and actually refused the offer of Excelmans, through whose troops he passed, to set him free. No one at the time, except the wretched refugees of Ghent, could have suspected, after the capitulation, that there was any special danger for Ney. And it is very difficult to see on what principle the Bourbons chose their victims or intended victims. Drouot, for example, had never served Louis XVIII, he had never worn the white cockade, he had left France with Napoleon for Elba, and had served the emperor there. In 1815 he had fought under his own sovereign. After Waterloo he had exerted all his great influence, the greater from his position, to induce the Guard to retire behind the lawyer, and to submit to the Bourbons. It was because Davoust so needed him that Drouot remained with the army. Still Drouot was selected for death, but the evidence of his position was too strong to enable the court to condemn him. Cambronne, another selection, had also gone with Napoleon to Elba. Savary, another selection, had, as was eventually acknowledged, only joined Napoleon when he was in full possession of the reins of government. Bertrand, who was condemned while at St. Helena, was in the same position as Drouot. In fact, if anyone were to draw up a list of probable proscriptions and compare it with those of the 24th of July, 1815, there would probably be few names common to both except Labedoyer, Mouton Duvernet, etc. The truth is that the Bourbons, and, to do them justice, still more the rancorous band of mediocrities who surrounded them, thirsted for blood. Even they could feel the full ignominy of the flight to Ghent. While they had been chanting the glories of the Restoration, the devotion of the people, the valor of the princes, Napoleon had landed, the Restoration had vanished like a bad dream, and the princes were the first to lead the way to the frontier. To protest that there had been a conspiracy, and that the conspirators must suffer, was the only possible cloak for the shame of the royalists. Who could not see that the only conspiracy was the universal one of the nation against the miserable men who knew not how to govern a high-spirited people? Ney, arrested on the 5th of August, was first brought before a military court on the 9th of November composed of Marshal Jourdan, President, Marshals Messina, Augereau, and Mortier, Lieutenants General Gazan, Claparede, and Villatte, members. Moncey had refused to sit, and Messina urged to the court his own quarrels with Ney in Spain to get rid of the task, but was forced to remain. Defended by both the barriers, Ney unfortunately denied the jurisdiction of the court-martial over him as a peer. In all probability the military court would have acquitted him. Too glad at the moment to be free from the trial of their old comrade, not understanding the danger of the proceeding, the court, by a majority of 5 against 2, declared themselves non-competent. And on the 21st of November Ney was sent before the Chamber of Peers, which condemned him on the 6th of December. To beg the life of his brave adversary would have been such an obvious act of generosity on the part of the Duke of Wellington that we may be pardoned for examining his reasons for not interfering. First, the Duke seems to have laid weight on the fact that if Ney had believed the capitulation had covered him he would not have hidden. Now, even before Ney knew of his exception from the amnesty, to appear in Paris would have been a foolish piece of bravado. Further, the royalist reaction was in full vigor, and when the royalist mobs, with the connivance of the authorities, were murdering Marshal Brune and attacking any prominent adherents of Napoleon. It was hardly the time for Ney to travel in full pomp. It cannot be said that, apart from the capitulation, the Duke had no responsibility. Generally a government executing a prisoner, may, with some force, if rather brutally, urge that the fact of their being able to try and execute him in itself shows their authority to do so. The Bourbons could not even use this argument. If the Allies had evacuated France, Louis Le Désiré would have ordered his carriage and have been at the frontier before they had reached it. If Frenchmen actually fired the shots which killed Ney, the Allies at least shared the responsibility with the French government. Lastly, it would seem that the Duke would have asked for the life of Ney if the king, clever at such small artifices, had not purposely affected a temporary coldness to him. Few men would have been so deterred from asking for the life of a dog. The fact is, the Duke of Wellington was a great general, he was a single-hearted and patriotic statesman, he had 1,000 virtues, but he was never generous. It cannot be said that he simply shared the feelings of his army, for there was preparation among some of his officers to enable Ney to escape, and Ney had to be guarded by men of good position disguised in the uniform of privates. Ney had written to his wife when he joined Napoleon, thinking of the little vexations the royalists loved to inflict on the men who had conquered the continent. You will no longer weep when you leave the Tuileries. The unfortunate lady wept now as she vainly sought some mercy for her husband. Arrested on the 5th of August, sentenced on the 6th of December, Ney was shot on the 7th of December, and the very manner of his execution shows that, in taking his life there was much more of revenge than of justice. If Ney were to be shot, it is obvious that it should have been as a high act of justice. If neither the rank or the services of the criminal were to save him, his death could not be too formal, too solemn, too public. Even an ordinary military execution is always carried out with grave and striking forms. There is a grand parade of the troops, that all may see with their own eyes the last act of the law. After the execution the troops defile past the body, that all may see the criminal actually dead. There was nothing of all this in the execution of Ney. A few chance passers, in the early morning of the 7th of December, 1815, saw a small body of troops waiting by the wall of the garden of the Luxembourg. A fiacre drove up, out of which got Marshal Ney in plain clothes, himself surprised by the everyday aspect of the place. Then, when the officer of the firing party, for such the spectators now knew it to be, saw whom it was he was to fire on, he became, it is said, perfectly petrified, and a peer, one of the judges of Ney, the Duc de la Force, took his place. Ney fell at the first volley with 6 balls in his breast, 3 in the head and neck, and 1 in the arm, and in a quarter of an hour the body was removed. Plain Michel Ney, as he had said to the secretary enunciating his title and reading his sentence, plain Michel Ney, soon to be a little dust. The communists caught red-handed in the streets of Paris in 1870 died with hardly less formality than was observed at the death scene of the Prince of the Moskowa and Duke of Elchingen, and the truth then became plain. The Bourbons could not, dared not, attempt to carry out the sentence of the law with the forms of the law. The government did not venture to let the troops or the people face the marshal. The forms of the law could not be carried out, the demands of revenge could be. And if this be thought any exaggeration, the proof of the ill effects of this murder, for its form makes it difficult to call it anything else, is ready to our hands. It was impossible to get the public to believe that Ney had really been killed in this manner, and nearly to this day we have had fresh stories recurring of the real Ney being discovered in America. The deed, however, had really been done. The marshals now knew that when the princes fled they themselves must remain to die for the royal cause. And Louis had at last succeeded in preventing his return to his kingdom amongst the baggage wagons of the Allies from being considered as a mere subject for jeers. One detail of the execution of Ney, however, we are told nothing of. We do not know if his widow, like Madame Labedoyer, had to pay 3 francs a head to the soldiers of the firing party which shot her husband. Whatever were the faults of the Bourbons, they at least carried out their executions economically. The statesmen of France, distinguished as they were, certainly did not rise to a level with the situation either in 1814 or in 1815. In 1814, it is true, they were almost stunned by the crash of the empire, and little as they foresaw the restoration of the Bourbons, still less could they have anticipated the extraordinary follies which were to be perpetrated. In 1815 there was less excuse for their helplessness, and, overawed as they were by the mass of foes which was pouring on them to complete the disaster of Waterloo, still it is disappointing to find that there was no one to seize the helm of power. And, confronting the Allies, to stipulate proper terms for France, and for the brave men who had fought for her. The steady Davoust was there with his 100,000 men to add weight to their language, and the total helplessness of the older line of the Bourbons had been too evidently displayed to make their return a certainty. So that there is no reason to doubt that a firm-hearted patriot might have saved France from much of the degradation and loss inflicted on her when once the Allies had again got her at their mercy. At the least the Bourbons might have been deprived of the revenge they sought for in taking some of the best blood of France. Better for Ney and his comrades to have fallen in a last struggle before Paris than to be shot by Frenchmen emboldened by the presence of foreign troops. Talleyrand, the most prominent figure among the statesmen, was away. His absence at Vienna during the First Restoration was undoubtedly the cause of many of the errors then committed. His ability as displayed under Napoleon has been much exaggerated, for, as the Duke of Wellington said, it was easy enough to be foreign minister to a government in military possession of Europe. But at least he was above the petty trivialities and absurdities of the Bourbon court. On the receipt of the news of the landing of Napoleon he really seems to have believed that the enterprise would immediately end in disaster, and he pressed on the outlawing of the man who had overwhelmed him with riches, and who had, at the worst, left him when in disgrace in quiet possession of all his ill-gotten wealth. But, as the power of Napoleon became more and more displayed, as perhaps Talleyrand found that the Austrians were not quite so firm as they wished to be considered, and as he foresaw the possible chances of the Orleans family, he became rather lukewarm in his attention to the king, to whom he had recently been bewailing the hardships of his separation from his loved monarch. He suddenly found that, after a congress, the first duty of a diplomatist was to look after his liver, and Carlsbad offered an agreeable retreat where he could wait till he might congratulate the winner in the struggle. Louis deeply resented this conduct of his foreign minister, and when Talleyrand at last joined him with all his doubts resolved, the king took the first opportunity of dismissing him, leaving the calm Talleyrand for once stuttering with rage. Louis soon, however, found that he was not the free agent he believed. The Allies did not want to have to again replace their puppet on the throne, and they looked on Talleyrand and Fouché as the two necessary men. Talleyrand was reinstated immediately, and remained for some time at the head of the ministry. He was, however, not the man for parliamentary government, being too careless in business, and trying to gain his ends more by clever tricks than straightforward measures. As for the state into which he let the government fall, it was happily characterized by M. Bunot. Until now, said he, we have only known three sorts of governments, the monarchical, the aristocratic, and the republican. Now we have invented a new one, which has never been heard of before, paternal anarchy. In September 1815 the elections to the chamber were bringing in deputies more royalist than the king, and Talleyrand sought to gain popularity by throwing over Fouché. To his horror it appeared that, well contented with this step, the deputies next asked and the former bishop was to be dismissed. Taking advantage of what Talleyrand conceived to be a happy way of eliciting a strong expression of royal support by threatening to resign, the king replaced him by the Duc de Richelieu. It was well to cut jokes at the Duke and say that he was the man in France who knew most of the Crimea. The Duke had been long in the Russian service, with the approval of Napoleon, but Talleyrand was overwhelmed. He received the same office at court which he had held under Napoleon, Grand Chamberlain, and afterwards remained a sardonic spectator of events, a not unimposing figure attending at the court ceremonials and at the heavy dinners of the king, and probably lending a helping hand in 1830 to oust Charles X from the throne. The monarchy of July sent him as ambassador to England, where he mixed in local politics, for example, plotting against Lord Palmerston, whose brusque manners he disliked. And in 1838 he ended his strange life with some dignity, having, as one of his eulogists puts it, been faithful to every government he had served as long as it was possible to save them. With the darker side of Talleyrand's character we have nothing to do here. It is sufficient for our purposes to say that the part the leading statesman of France took during the Cent-Jours was simply nil. In 1814, he had let the reins slip through his hands. 1815 he could only follow the king, who even refused to adopt his advice as to the proper way in which to return to France, and though he once more became chief minister, Talleyrand, like Louis XVIII, owed his restoration in 1815 solely to the Allies. The Comte d'Artois, the brother of the king, and later king himself as Charles X, was sent to Lyons, to which place the Duc d'Orléans followed him, and where the two princes met Marshal MacDonald. The marshal did all that man could do to keep the soldiers true to the Bourbons, but he had to advise the princes to return to Paris, and he himself had to fly for his life when he attempted to stop Napoleon in person. The Duc d'Orléans was then sent to the north to hold Lille, where the king intended to take refuge, and the Comte d'Artois remained with the court. The court was very badly off for money. The king, and Clark, Duke of Feltry, the war minister, were the only happy possessors of carriages. They passed their time, as the Abbé Louis once bitterly remarked, in saying foolish things till they had a chance of doing them. The Comte d'Artois, who, probably wisely, certainly cautiously, had refused to go with de Vitrolles to stir up the south until he had placed the king in safety, had ended by going to Ghent too, while the Duc de Berry was at Alost, close by, with a tiny army composed of the remains of the Maison du Roi, of which the most was made in reports. The Duc d'Orléans, always an object of suspicion to the king, had left France with the royal party, but had refused to stay in Belgium, as he alleged that it was an enemy's country. He crossed to England where he remained, greatly adding to the anxiety of Louis by refusing to join him. The end of these princes is well known. Louis died in 1824, leaving his throne to his brother. But Charles only held it till 1830, when after the rising called the 3 Glorious Days of July, he was civilly escorted from France, and took shelter in England. The Duc Angoulême died without issue. The Duc de Berry was assassinated in 1820, but his widow gave birth to a posthumous son, the Duc de Bordeaux, or, to fervid royalists, Henri V. Though better known to us as the Comte de Chambord, who died in 1883 without issue, thus ending the then eldest line of Bourbons, and transmitting his claims to the Orleans family. On the fall of Charles X, the Duc d'Orléans became king of the French, but he was unseated by the Revolution of 1848, and died a refugee in England. As the 3 princes of the House of Condé, the Prince de Condé, his son, the Duc de Bourbon, and his grandson, the Duc d'Enghien, all died without further male issue, that noble line is extinct. When the news of the escape of Napoleon from Elba reached Vienna on the 7th of March, 1815, the three heads of the Allies, the emperors of Austria and Russia, and the King of Prussia, were still there. Though it was said that the Congress danced but did not advance, still a great deal of work had really been done, and the news of Napoleon's landing created a fresh bond of union between the Allies which stopped all further chances of disunion, and enabled them to practically complete their work by the 9th of June, 1815, though the treaties required cobbling for some years afterwards. France, Austria, and England had snatched the greater part of Saxony from the jaws of Prussia, and Alexander had been forced to leave the King of Saxony to reign over half of his former subjects, without, as he wished, sparing him the pain of such a degradation by taking all from him. Russia had to be contented with a large increase of her Polish dominions, getting most of the Grand Duchy of Westphalia. Austria had, probably unwisely, withdrawn from her former outlying provinces in Swabia and the Netherlands, which had before the Revolution made her necessarily the guardian of Europe against France, preferring to take her gains in Italy. Gains which she has gradually lost in our days. While Prussia, by accepting the Rhine provinces, completely stepped into the former post of Austria. Indeed, from the way in which Prussia was, after 1815, as it were, scattered across Germany, it was evident that her fate must be either to be crushed by France or else, by annexing the states enclosed in her dominions, to become the predominating power in Germany. It was impossible for her to remain as she was left. The Allies tightly bound France. They had no desire to have again to march on Paris to restore Louis to the subjects who had such unfortunate objections to being subjected to that desirable monarch. By the Second Treaty of Paris, on the 20th of November, 1815, France was to be occupied by an Allied force, in military positions on the frontier, not to exceed 150,000 men, to be taken from all the Allied armies, under a commander who was eventually the Duke of Wellington. Originally the occupation was not to exceed 5 years, but in February 1817 the army was reduced by 30,000 men, 1/5 of each contingent. And by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle of October 9, 1818, France was to be evacuated by the 30th of November, 1818. The three monarchs were probably not sorry to get the Congress over on any terms. Alexander had had his fill of displaying himself in the salons in his favorite part of an Agamemnon generous towards Troy, and he had worn out his first popularity. He was stung by finding some of his favorite plans boldly opposed by Talleyrand and by Metternich, and, indeed, was anxious to meet the last in open combat. Francis had required all the firmness of what he called his Bohemian head to resist the threats, entreaties, and cajoleries employed to get him to acquiesce in the dethronement of the King of Saxony, and the wiping out of the Saxon nationality by the very alliance which professed to fight only for the rights of nations and of their lawful sovereigns. All three monarchs had again the satisfaction of entering Paris, but without enjoying the full glories of 1814. Our friends, the enemies, were not so popular then in France, and the spoliation of the Louvre was not pleasant even to the royalists. The foreign monarchs soon returned to their own drained and impoverished states. The Emperor Francis had afterwards a quiet reign to his death in 1835, having only to assist his minister in snuffing out the occasional flashes of a love of freedom in Germany. The King of Prussia returned in a triumph well won by his sturdy subjects, and, in the light of his new honors, the Countess von Voss tells us he was really handsome. He was now at leisure to resume the discussions on uniform, and the work of fastening and unfastening the numerous buttons of his pantaloons, in which he had been so roughly interrupted by Jena. The first institution of the Zollverein, or commercial union with several states, gradually extended, was a measure which did much for the unification of Germany. With his brother sovereigns he revisited Paris at the end of the military occupation in 1818, remaining there longer than the others, because, said the Parisians, he had discovered an actor at a small theatre who achieved the feat of making him laugh. He died in 1840. His queen, heartbroken, it was said, had died in 1810. Alexander was still brimming over with the best and most benevolent intentions towards everyone. The world was to be free, happy, and religious. But he had rather vague ideas as to how his plans were to be carried out. Thus it is characteristic that when his successor desired to have a solemn coronation as King of Poland, it was found that Alexander had not foreseen the difficulties which were met with in trying to arrange for the coronation of a sovereign of the Greek Church as king of a Roman Catholic state. The much dreaded but very misty Holy Alliance was one of the few fruits of Alexander's visions. His mind is described as passing through a regular series of stages with each influence under which he acted. He ended his life, tired out, disillusioned, deceived in everything, weighed down with regret. Obliged to crush the very hopes of his people he had encouraged, dying in 1825 at Taganrog, leaving his new Polish kingdom to be wiped out by his successors. The minor sovereigns require little mention. They retained any titles they had received from Napoleon, while they exulted at being free from his heavy hand and sharp superintendence. Each got a share, small or great, of the spoil except the poor King of Denmark, who, being assured by Alexander on his departure that he carried away all hearts, answered, "Yes, but not any souls." The reintroduction of much that was bad in the old system, one country even going so far as to re-establish torture, the steady attack on liberty and on all liberal ideas. Württemberg being practically the only state which grumbled at the tightening of the reins so dear to Metternich. All formed a fitting commentary on the proclamations by which the sovereigns had hounded on their people against the man they represented as the one obstacle to the freedom and peace of Europe. In gloom and disenchantment the nation sat down to lick their wounds, the contempt shown by the monarchs for everything but the right of conquest. The manner in which they treated the lands won from Napoleon as a gigantic pool which was to be shared amongst them, so many souls to each. Their total failure to fulfill their promises to their subjects of granting liberty, all these slowly bore their fruits in after years, and their effects are not even yet exhausted. The right of a sovereign to hold his lands was now, by the public law of Europe, to be decided by his strength. The rights of the people were treated as not existing. Truly, as our most gifted poetess has sung, the kings crept out, the peoples sat at home, and finding the long invocate peace. A pall embroidered with worn images of rights divine, too scant to cover doom. Such as they suffered, nursed the corn that grew rankly to bitter bread, on Waterloo. Chapter 13. This chapter, by the editor of the 1836 edition, is based upon the Memorial, and O'Mara's and Antomarchi's works. 1815 to 1821. Voyage to St. Helena, Personal Traits of the Emperor, Arrival at Jamestown, Napoleon's temporary residence at the Briars, Removal to Longwood, the daily routine there, the Campaign of Italy, the arrival of Sir Hudson Lowe, unpleasant relations between the Emperor and the new governor, visitors at St. Helena, Captain Basil Hall's interview with Napoleon, anecdotes of the Emperor, departure of Las Cases and O'Mara, arrivals from Europe, physical habits of the Emperor, Dr. Antomarchi, the Emperor's toilet, creation of a new bishopric. The Emperor's energy with the spade, his increasing illness. Last days of Napoleon, his death, lying in state, military funeral. Marchand's account of the Emperor's last moments, Napoleon's last bequests, the watch of Rivoli. The closing scenes in the life of the great Emperor only now remain to be briefly touched upon. In a previous chapter we have narrated the surrender of Napoleon, his voyage to England, and his transference from the Bellerophon to the Northumberland. The latter vessel was in great confusion from the short notice at which she had sailed, and for the 2 first days the crew was employed in restoring order. The space abaft the mizzenmast contained a dining room about 10 feet broad, and extending the whole width of the ship, a saloon, and 2 cabins. The Emperor occupied the cabin on the left, in which his camp bedstead had been put up. That on the right was appropriated to the admiral. It was peremptorily enjoined that the saloon should be in common. The form of the dining table resembled that of the dining room. Napoleon sat with his back to the saloon. On his left sat Madame Bertrand, and on his right the admiral, who, with Madame de Montholon, filled up one side of the table. Next that lady, but at the end of the table, was Captain Ross, who commanded the ship, and at the opposite end M. de Montholon, Madame Bertrand, and the admiral's secretary. The side of the table facing the emperor was occupied by the Grand Marshal, the colonel of the field regiment, Las Cases, and Gourgaud. The admiral invited one or two of the officers to dinner every day, and the band of the 53d, newly formed, played during dinner time. On the 10th of August the Northumberland cleared the channel, and lost sight of land. The course of the ship was shaped to cross the Bay of Biscay and double Cape Finisterre. The wind was fair, though light, and the heat excessive. Napoleon breakfasted in his own cabin at irregular hours. He sent for one of his attendants every morning to know the distance run, the state of the wind, and other particulars connected with their progress. He read a great deal, dressed towards 4 o'clock, and then came into the public saloon. Here he played at chess with one of the party. At 5 o'clock the admiral announced that dinner was on the table. It is well known that Napoleon was scarcely ever more than 15 minutes at dinner. Here the two courses alone took up nearly an hour and a half. This was a serious annoyance to him, though his features and manner always evinced perfect equanimity. Neither the new system of cookery nor the quality of the dishes ever met with his censure. He was waited on by two valets, who stood behind his chair. At first the admiral was in the habit of offering several dishes to the emperor, but the acknowledgment of the latter was expressed so coldly that the practice was given up. The admiral thenceforth only pointed out to the servants what was preferable. Napoleon was generally silent, as if unacquainted with the language, though it was French. If he spoke, it was to ask some technical or scientific question, or to address a few words to those whom the admiral occasionally asked to dinner. The emperor rose immediately after coffee had been handed round, and went on deck, followed by the Grand Marshal and Las Cases. This disconcerted Admiral Cockburn, who expressed his surprise to his officers. But Madame Bertrand, whose maternal language was English, replied with spirit, "Do not forget, sir, that your guest is a man who has governed a large portion of the world, and that kings once contended for the honor of being admitted to his table." "Very true," rejoined the admiral, and from that time he did his utmost to comply with Napoleon's habits. He shortened the time of sitting at table, ordering coffee for Napoleon and those who accompanied him even before the rest of the company had finished their dinner. The emperor remained walking on deck till dark. On returning to the after cabin he sat down to play vingt et un with some of his suite, and generally retired in about half an hour. On the morning of the 15th of August all his suite asked permission to be admitted to his presence. He was not aware of the cause of this visit. It was his birthday, which seemed to have altogether escaped his recollection. On the following day they doubled Cape Finisterre, and up to the 21st, passing off the Straits of Gibraltar, continued their course along the coast of Africa towards Madeira. Napoleon commonly remained in his cabin the whole morning, and from the extreme heat he wore a very slight dress. He could not sleep well, and frequently rose in the night. Reading was his chief occupation. He often sent for Count Las Cases to translate whatever related to St. Helena or the countries by which they were sailing. Napoleon used to start a subject of conversation, or revive that of some preceding day, and when he had taken 8 or 9 turns the whole length of the deck he would seat himself on the second gun from the gangway on the larboard side. The midshipmen soon observed this habitual predilection, so that the cannon was thenceforth called the Emperor's gun. It was here that Napoleon often conversed for hours together. On the 22d of August they came within sight of Madeira, and at night arrived off the port. They stopped for a day or two to take in provisions. Napoleon was indisposed. A sudden gale arose and the air was filled with small particles of sand and the suffocating exhalations from the deserts of Africa. On the evening of the 24th they got under way again, and progressed smoothly and rapidly. The emperor added to his amusements a game at piquet. He was but an indifferent chess player, and there was no very good one on board. He asked, jestingly, how it was that he frequently beat those who beat better players than himself. XIII was given up, as they played too high at it, and Napoleon had a great aversion to gaming. One night a negro threw himself overboard to avoid a flogging, which occasioned a great noise and bustle. A young midshipman meeting Las Cases descending into the cabin, and thinking he was going to inform Napoleon, caught hold of his coat and in a tone of great concern exclaimed, "Sir, do not alarm the emperor. Tell him the noise is owing to an accident." In general the midshipman behaved with marked respect and attention to Bonaparte, and often by signs or words directed the sailors to avoid incommoding him. He sometimes noticed this conduct, and remarked that youthful hearts were always prone to generous instincts. On the 1st of September they found themselves in the latitude of the Cape de Verde Islands. Everything now promised a prosperous passage, but the time hung heavily. Las Cases had undertaken to teach his son English, and the emperor also expressed a wish to learn. He, however, soon grew tired and laid it aside, nor was it resumed until long afterwards. His manners and habits were always the same. He invariably appeared contented, patient, and good-humored. The admiral gradually laid aside his reserve, and took an interest in his great captive. He pointed out the danger incurred by coming on deck after dinner, owing to the damp of the evening. The emperor would then sometimes take his arm and prolong the conversation, talking sometimes on naval affairs, on the French resources in the south, and on the improvements he had contemplated in the ports and harbors of the Mediterranean, to all which the admiral listened with deep attention. Meanwhile Napoleon observed that Las Cases was busily employed, and obtained a sight of his journal, with which he was not displeased. He, however, noticed that some of the military details and anecdotes gave but a meager idea of the subject of war. This first led to the proposal of his writing his own memoirs. At length the emperor came to a determination, and on Saturday, the 9th of September he called his secretary into his cabin and dictated to him some particulars of the siege of Toulon. On approaching the line they fell in with the trade winds, that blow here constantly from the east. On the 16th there was a considerable fall of rain, to the great joy of the sailors, who were in want of water. The rain began to fall heavily just as the emperor had got upon deck to take his afternoon walk. But this did not disappoint him of his usual exercise. He merely called for his famous grey greatcoat, which the crew regarded with much interest. On the 23rd of September they passed the line. This was a day of great merriment and disorder among the crew. It was the ceremony which the English sailors call the christening. No one is spared, and the officers are generally more roughly handled than anyone else. The admiral, who had previously amused himself by giving an alarming description of this ceremony, now very courteously exempted his guests from the inconvenience and ridicule attending it. Napoleon was scrupulously respected through the whole of this Saturnalian festivity. On being informed of the decorum which had been observed with regard to him he ordered 100 Napoleons to be presented to the grotesque Neptune and his crew, which the admiral opposed, perhaps from motives of prudence as well as politeness. Owing to the haste with which they had left England the painting of the ship had been only lately finished, and this circumstance confined Napoleon, whose sense of smell was very acute, to his room for 2 days. They were now, in the beginning of October, driven into the Gulf of Guinea, where they met a French vessel bound for the Isle of Bourbon. They spoke with the captain, who expressed his surprise and regret when he learnt that Napoleon was on board. The wind was unfavorable, and the ship made little progress. The sailors grumbled at the admiral, who had gone out of the usual course. At length they approached the termination of their voyage. On the 14th of October the admiral had informed them that he expected to come within sight of St. Helena that day. They had scarcely risen from table when their ears were saluted with the cry of "Land." This was within a quarter of an hour of the time that had been fixed on. The emperor went on the forecastle to see the island, but it was still hardly distinguishable. At daybreak next morning they had a tolerably clear view of it. At length, about 70 days after his departure from England, and 110 after quitting Paris, Napoleon reached St. Helena. In the harbor were several vessels of the squadron which had separated from them, and which they thought they had left behind. Napoleon, contrary to custom, dressed early and went upon deck. He went forward to the gangway to view the island. He beheld a kind of village surrounded by numerous barren hills towering to the clouds. Every platform, every aperture, the brow of every hill was planted with cannon. The emperor viewed the prospect through his glass. His countenance underwent no change. He soon left the deck, and sending for Las Cases, proceeded to his day's work. The admiral, who had gone ashore very early, returned about 6 much fatigued. He had been walking over various parts of the island, and at length thought he had found a habitation that would suit his captives. The place stood in need of repairs, which might occupy 2 months. His orders were not to let the French quit the vessel till a house should be prepared to receive them. He, however, undertook, on his own responsibility, to set them on shore the next day. On the 16th, after dinner, Napoleon, accompanied by the admiral and the Grand Marshal, Bertrand, got into a boat to go ashore. As he passed, the officers assembled on the quarter-deck, and the greater part of the crew on the gangways. The emperor, before he stepped into the boat, sent for the captain of the vessel, and took leave of him, desiring him at the same time to convey his thanks to the officers and crew. These words appeared to produce the liveliest sensation in all by whom they were understood, or to whom they were interpreted. The remainder of his suite landed about 8. They found the emperor in the apartments which had been assigned to him, a few minutes after he went upstairs to his chamber. He was lodged in a sort of inn in Jamestown, which consists only of one short street, or row of houses built in a narrow valley between 2 rocky hills. The next day the emperor, the Grand Marshal, and the admiral, riding out to visit Longwood, which had been chosen for the emperor's residence, on their return saw a small villa, with a pavilion attached to it, about 2 miles from the town. The residence of Mr. Balcombe, a merchant of the island. This spot pleased Napoleon, and the admiral was of opinion that it would be better for him to remain here than to return to the town, where the sentinels at his door, with the crowds collected round it, in a manner confined him to his chamber. The pavilion was a sort of summer house on a pyramidal eminence, about 30 or 40 paces from the house, where the family were accustomed to resort in fine weather. This was hired for the temporary abode of the emperor. And he took possession of it immediately. There was a carriage road from the town, and the valley was in this part less rugged in its aspect. Las Cases was soon sent for. As he ascended the winding path leading to the pavilion he saw Napoleon standing at the threshold of the door. His body was slightly bent, and his hands behind his back. He wore his usual plain and simple uniform and the well-known hat. The emperor was alone. He took a fancy to walk a little. But there was no level ground on any side of the pavilion, which was surrounded by huge pieces of rock. Taking the arm of his companion, however, he began to converse in a cheerful strain. When Napoleon was about to retire to rest, the servants found that one of the windows was open close to the bed. They barricaded it as well as they could, so as to exclude the air, to the effects of which the emperor was very susceptible. Las Cases ascended to an upper room. The valets de chambers lay stretched in their cloaks across the threshold of the door. Such was the first night Napoleon passed at the Briars. An English officer was lodged with them in the house as their guard, and 2 non-commissioned officers were stationed near the house to watch their movements. Napoleon the next day proceeded with his dictation, which occupied him for several hours, and then took a walk in the garden, where he was met by the 2 Misses Balcombe, lively girls about 14 years of age, who presented him with flowers, and overwhelmed him with whimsical questions. Napoleon was amused by their familiarity, to which he had been little accustomed. "We have been to a masked ball," said he, when the young ladies had taken their leave. The next day a chicken was brought for breakfast, which the emperor undertook to carve himself, and was surprised at his succeeding so well, it being a long time since he had done so much. The coffee he considered so bad that on tasting it he thought himself poisoned, and sent it away. The mornings were passed in business. In the evening Napoleon sometimes strolled to the neighboring villa, where the young ladies made him play at whist. The campaign of Italy was nearly finished, and Las Cases proposed that the other followers of Napoleon who were lodged in the town should come up every morning to assist in transcribing the campaign of Egypt, the history of the consulate, etc. This suggestion pleased the ex-emperor, so that from that time one or two of his suite came regularly every day to write to his dictation, and stayed to dinner. A tent, sent by the colonel of the 53d Regiment, was spread out so as to form a prolongation of the pavilion. Their cook took up his abode at the Briars. The table linen was taken from the trunks, the plate was set forth, and the first dinner after these new arrangements was a sort of fete. One day at dinner Napoleon, casting his eye on one of the dishes of his own campaign service, on which the arms of the king had been engraved, "How they have spoiled that," he exclaimed. And he could not refrain from observing that the king was in great haste to take possession of the imperial plate, which certainly did not belong to him. Amongst the baggage was also a cabinet in which were a number of medallions, given him by the Pope and other potentates, some letters of Louis XVIII, which he had left behind him on his writing table in the suddenness of his flight from the Tuileries on the 20th of March, and a number of other letters found in the portfolio of M. de Blocas intended to calumniate Napoleon. The emperor never dressed until about 4 o'clock, he then walked in the garden, which was particularly agreeable to him on account of its solitude, the English soldiers having been removed at Mr. Balcomb's request. A little arbor was covered with canvas, and a chair and table placed in it, and here Napoleon dictated a great part of his memoirs. In the evening, when he did not go out, he generally contrived to prolong the conversation till 11 or 12 o'clock. Thus time passed with little variety or interruption. The weather in the winter became delightful. One day, his usual task being done, Napoleon strolled out towards the town, until he came within sight of the road and shipping. On his return he met Mrs. Balcombe and a Mrs. Stewart, who was on her way back from Bombay to England. The emperor conversed with her on the manners and customs of India, and on the inconveniences of a long voyage at sea, particularly to ladies. He alluded to Scotland, Mrs. Stewart's native country, expatiated on the genius of Ossian, and congratulated his fair interlocutor on the preservation of her clear northern complexion. While the parties were thus engaged some heavily burdened slaves passed near to them. Mrs. Balcombe motioned them to make a detour, but Napoleon interposed, exclaiming, "Respect the burden, madam." As he said this the Scotch lady, who had been very eagerly scanning the features of Napoleon, whispered to her friend, "Heavens! What a character, and what an expression of countenance! How different to the idea I had formed of him." Napoleon shortly after repeated the same walk, and went into the house of Major Hudson. This visit occasioned considerable alarm to the constituted authorities. The governor gave a ball, to which the French were invited. And Las Cases about the same time rode over to Longwood to see what advance had been made in the preparations for their reception. His report on his return was not very favorable. They had now been 6 weeks at the Briars, during which Napoleon had been nearly as much confined as if on board the vessel. His health began to be impaired by it. Las Cases gave it as his opinion that the emperor did not possess that constitution of iron which was usually ascribed to him. And that it was the strength of his mind, not of his body, that carried him through the labors of the field and of the cabinet. In speaking on this subject Napoleon himself observed that nature had endowed him with two peculiarities: one was the power of sleeping at any hour or in any place. The other, his being incapable of committing any excess either in eating or drinking. "If," said he, "I go the least beyond my mark my stomach instantly revolts." He was subject to nausea from very slight causes, and to colds from any change of air. The prisoners removed to Longwood on the 10th of December, 1815. Napoleon invited Mr. Balcombe to breakfast with him that morning, and conversed with him in a very cheerful manner. About 2 Admiral Cockburn was announced. He entered with an air of embarrassment. In consequence of the restraints imposed upon him at the Briars, and the manner in which those of his suite residing in the town had been treated, Bonaparte had discontinued receiving the visits of the admiral. Yet on the present occasion he behaved towards him as though nothing had happened. At length they left the briars and set out for Longwood. Napoleon rode the horse, a small, sprightly, and tolerably handsome animal, which had been brought for him from the Cape. He wore his uniform of the chasseurs of the guard, and his graceful manner and handsome countenance were particularly remarked. The admiral was very attentive to him. At the entrance of Longwood they found a guard under arms who rendered the prescribed honors to their illustrious captive. His horse, unaccustomed to parades, and frightened by the roll of the drum, refused to pass the gate till spurred on by Napoleon, while a significant look passed among the escort. The admiral took great pains to point out the minutest details at Longwood. He had himself superintended all the arrangements, among which was a bathroom. Bonaparte was satisfied with everything, and the admiral seemed highly pleased. He had anticipated petulance and disdain, but Napoleon manifested perfect good humor. The entrance to the house was through a room which had been just built to answer the double purpose of an antechamber and a dining room. This apartment led to the drawing room. Beyond this was a third room running in a cross direction and very dark. This was intended to be the depository of the emperor's maps and books, but it was afterwards converted into the dining room. The emperor's chamber opened into this apartment on the right-hand side, and was divided into two equal parts, forming a cabinet and sleeping room. A little external gallery served for a bathing room. Opposite the emperor's chamber, at the other extremity of the building, were the apartments of Madame Montholon, her husband, and her son, afterward used as the emperor's library. Detached from this part of the house was a little square room on the ground floor, contiguous to the kitchen, which was assigned to Las Cases. The windows and beds had no curtains. The furniture was mean and scanty. Bertrand and his family resided at a distance of 2 miles, at a place called Rutt's Gate. General Gourgaud slept under a tent, as well as Mr. O'Mara, and the officer commanding the guard. The house was surrounded by a garden. In front, and separated by a tolerably deep ravine, was encamped the 53d Regiment, different parties of which were stationed on the neighboring heights. The domestic establishment of the emperor consisted of 11 persons. To the Grand Marshal was confided the general superintendence, to M. de Montholon the domestic details, Las Cases was to take care of the furniture and property, and General Gourgaud to have the management of the stables. These arrangements, however, produced discontent among Napoleon's attendants. Las Cases admits that they were no longer the members of one family, each using his best efforts to promote the advantage of all. They were far from practicing that which necessity dictated. He says also, the admiral has more than once, in the midst of our disputes with him, hastily exclaimed that the emperor was decidedly the most good-natured, just, and reasonable of the whole set. On his first arrival he went to visit the barracks occupied by some Chinese living on the island, and a place called Longwood Farm. He complained to Las Cases that they had been idle of late. But by degrees their hours and the employment of them became fixed and regular. The campaign of Italy being now finished, Napoleon corrected it, and dictated on other subjects. This was their morning's work. They dined between 8 and 9, Madame Montholon being seated on Napoleon's right, Las Cases on his left, and Gourgaud, Montholon, and Las Cases' son sitting opposite. The smell of the paint not being yet gone off, they remained not more than 10 minutes at table, and the dessert was prepared in the adjoining apartment, where coffee was served up and conversation commenced. Scenes were read from Molière, Racine, and Voltaire, and regret was always expressed at their not having a copy of Corneille. They then played at reverses, which had been Bonaparte's favorite game in his youth. The recollection was agreeable to him, and he thought he could amuse himself at it for any length of time, but was soon undeceived. His aim was always to make the reverses, that is, to win every trick. Character is displayed in the smallest incidents. Napoleon read a libel on himself, and contrasted the compliments which had passed between him and the Queen of Prussia with the brutal behavior ascribed to him in the English newspapers. On the other hand, 2 common sailors had at different times, while he was at Longwood and at the Briars, in spite of orders and at all risks, made their way through the sentinels to gain a sight of Napoleon. On seeing the interest they took in him he exclaimed, "This is fanaticism." Yes, imagination rules the world. The instructions of the English ministers with regard to the treatment of Napoleon at St. Helena had been prepared with the view completely to secure his person. An English officer was to be constantly at his table. This order, however, was not carried into effect. An officer was also to accompany Napoleon in all his rides. This order was dispensed with within certain prescribed limits, because Napoleon had refused to ride at all on such conditions. Almost every day brought with it some new cause of uneasiness and complaint. Sentinels were posted beneath Napoleon's windows and before his doors. This order was, however, doubtless given to prevent his being annoyed by impertinent curiosity. The French were certainly precluded from all free communication with the inhabitants of the island, but this precaution was of unquestionable necessity for the security of the emperor's person. Las Cases complains that the passwords were perpetually changed, so that they lived in constant perplexity and apprehension of being subjected to some unforeseen insult. Napoleon, he continues, addressed a complaint to the admiral, which obtained for him no redress. In the midst of these complaints the admiral wished to introduce some ladies, who had arrived in the Doric, to Napoleon. But he declined, not approving this alternation of affronts and civilities. He, however, consented, at the request of their colonel, to receive the officers of the 53d Regiment. After this officer took his leave, Napoleon prolonged his walk in the garden. He stopped a while to look at a flower in one of the beds, and asked his companion if it was not a lily. It was indeed a magnificent one. The thought that he had in his mind was obvious. He then spoke of the number of times he had been wounded, and said it had been thought he had never met with these accidents from his having kept them secret as much as possible. It was near the end of December. One day, after a walk and a tumble in the mud, Bonaparte returned and found a packet of English newspapers, which the Grand Marshal translated to him. This occupied him till late, and he forgot his dinner in discussing their contents. After dinner had been served, Las Cases wished to continue the translation, but Napoleon would not suffer him to proceed, from consideration for the weak state of his eyes. "We must wait till tomorrow," said he. A few days afterwards the admiral came in person to visit him, and the interview was an agreeable one. After some animated discussion it was arranged that Napoleon should henceforth ride freely about the island. That the officer should follow him only at a distance. And that visitors should be admitted to him, not with the permission of the admiral as the inspector of Longwood, but with that of the Grand Marshal, who was to do the honors of the establishment. These concessions were, however, soon recalled. On the 30th of this month Pionkowski, a Pole, who had been left behind, but whose entreaties prevailed upon the English government, joined Bonaparte. On New Year's Day all their little party was collected together, and Napoleon, entering into the feelings of the occasion, begged that they might breakfast and pass it together. Every day furnished some new trait of this kind. On the 14th of April, 1816 Sir Hudson Lowe, the new governor, arrived at St. Helena. This epoch is important, as making the beginning of a continued series of accusations, and counter-accusations, by which the last 5 years of Napoleon's life were constantly occupied, to the great annoyance of himself and all connected with him. And possibly to the shortening of his own existence. It would be tedious to detail the progress of this petty war, but, as a subject which has formed so great a portion of the life of Napoleon, it must not be omitted. To avoid anything which may appear like a bias against Napoleon, the details, unless when otherwise mentioned, will be derived from Las Cases, his devoted admirer. On the first visit of the new governor, which was the 16th of April, Napoleon refused to admit him, because he himself was ill, and also because the governor had not asked beforehand for an audience. On the second visit the governor was admitted to an audience, and Napoleon seems to have taken a prejudice at first sight, as he remarked to his suite that the governor was hideous, and had a most ugly countenance. Though he allowed he ought not to judge too hastily. The spirit of the party was shown by a remark made, that the first 2 days had been days of battle. The governor saw Napoleon again on the April 30th, and the interview was stormy. Napoleon argued with the governor on the conduct of the Allies towards him, said they had no right to dispose of him, who was their equal and sometimes their master. He then declaimed on the eternal disgrace the English had inflicted on themselves by sending him to St. Helena. They wished to kill him by a lingering death. Their conduct was worse than that of the Calabrians in shooting Marat. He talked of the cowardliness of suicide, complained of the small extent and horrid climate of St. Helena, and said it would be an act of kindness to deprive him of life at once. Sir H. Lowe said that a house of wood, fitted up with every possible accommodation, was then on its way from England for his use. Napoleon refused it at once, and exclaimed that it was not a house but an executioner and a coffin that he wanted. The house was a mockery, death would be a favor. A few minutes after Napoleon took up some reports of the campaigns of 1814, which lay on the table, and asked Sir H. Lowe if he had written them. Las Cases, after saying that the governor replied in the affirmative, finishes his account of the interview, but according to O'Mara, Napoleon said they were full of folly and falsehood. The governor, with a much milder reply than most men would have given, retired, and Napoleon harangued upon the sinister expression of his countenance, abused him in the coarsest manner, and made his servant throw a cup of coffee out of the window because it had stood a moment on a table near the governor. It was required that all persons who visited at Longwood or at Hut's Gate should make a report to the governor, or to Sir Thomas Reed, of the conversations they had held with the French. Several additional sentinels were posted around Longwood House and grounds. During some extremely wet and foggy weather Napoleon did not go out for several days. Messengers and letters continually succeeded one another from Plantation House. The governor appeared anxious to see Napoleon, and was evidently distrustful, although the residents at Longwood were assured of his actual presence by the sound of his voice. He had some communications with Count Bertrand on the necessity that one of his officers should see Napoleon daily. He also went to Longwood frequently himself, and finally, after some difficulty, succeeded in obtaining an interview with Napoleon in his bedchamber, which lasted about a quarter of an hour. Some days before he sent for Mr. O'Mara, asked a variety of questions concerning the captive, walked round the house several times and before the windows, measuring and laying down the plan of a new ditch, which he said he would have dug in order to prevent the cattle from trespassing. On the morning of the 5th of May Napoleon sent for his surgeon O'Mara to come to him. He was introduced into Napoleon's bedchamber, a description of which is thus given. It was about 14 feet by 12, and 10 or 11 feet in height. The walls were lined with brown nankeen, bordered and edged with common green bordering paper, and destitute of skirting. Two small windows without pulleys, one of which was thrown up and fastened by a piece of notched wood, looked towards the camp of the 53d Regiment. There were window curtains of white longcloth, a small fireplace, a shabby grate and fire irons to match, with a paltry mantelpiece of wood, painted white, upon which stood a small marble bust of his son. Above the mantelpiece hung the portrait of Maria Louisa, and 4 or 5 of young Napoleon, one of which was embroidered by the hands of his mother. A little more to the right hung also the portrait of the Empress Josephine. And to the left was suspended the alarm chamber watch of Frederick the Great, obtained by Napoleon at Potsdam. While on the right the consular watch, engraved with the cipher B, hung, by a chain of the plaited hair of Maria Louisa, from a pin stuck in the nankeen lining. In the right-hand corner was placed the little plain iron camp bedstead, with green silk curtains, on which its master had reposed on the fields of Marengo and Austerlitz. Between the windows there was a chest of drawers, and a bookcase with green blinds stood on the left of the door leading to the next apartment. 4 or 5 cane-bottomed chairs painted green were standing here and there about the room. Before the back door there was a screen covered with nankeen, and between that and the fireplace an old-fashioned sofa covered with white longcloth, on which Napoleon reclined, dressed in his white morning gown. White loose trousers and stockings all in one, a checkered red handkerchief upon his head, and his shirt collar open without a cravat. His air was melancholy and troubled. Before him stood a little round table, with some books, at the foot of which lay in confusion upon the carpet a heap of those which he had already perused. And at the opposite side of the sofa was suspended Isabey's portrait of the Empress Maria Louisa, holding her son in her arms. In front of the fireplace stood Las Cases with his arms folded over his breast and some papers in one of his hands. Of all the former magnificence of the once mighty Emperor of France nothing remained but a superb wash-hand stand containing a silver basin and water jug of the same metal, in the left-hand corner. The object of Napoleon in sending for O'Mara on this occasion was to question him whether in their future intercourse he was to consider him in the light of a spy and a tool of the governor or as his physician. The doctor gave a decided and satisfactory answer on this point. During the short interview that this governor had with me in my bedchamber, one of the first things he proposed was to send you away, said Napoleon to O'Mara, and that I should take his own surgeon in your place. This he repeated, and so earnest was he to gain his object that, though I gave him a flat refusal, when he was going out he turned about and again proposed it. On the 11th a proclamation was issued by the governor, forbidding any persons on the island from sending letters to or receiving them from General Bonaparte or his suite, on pain of being immediately arrested and dealt with accordingly. Nothing escaped the vigilance of Sir Hudson Lowe, the governor, said Napoleon, has just sent an invitation to Bertrand for General Bonaparte to come to Plantation House to meet Lady Moira. I told Bertrand to return no answer to it. If he really wanted me to see her he would have put Plantation House within the limits, but to send such an invitation, knowing I must go in charge of a guard if I wished to avail myself of it, was an insult. Soon after came the declaration of the Allies and the Acts of Parliament authorizing the detention of Napoleon Bonaparte as a prisoner of war and disturber of the peace of Europe. Against the bill, when brought into the House of Lords, there were two protests, those of Lord Holland and of the Duke of Sussex. These official documents did not tend to suit the temper or raise the spirits of the French to endure their captivity. In addition to the misery of his own captivity, Napoleon had to contend with the unmanageable humors of his own followers. As often happens with men in such circumstances, they sometimes disagreed among themselves, and part of their petulance and ill temper fell upon their chief. He took these little incidents deeply to heart. On one occasion he said in bitterness, "I know that I am fallen, but to feel this among you. I am aware that man is frequently unreasonable and susceptible of offense. Thus, when I am mistrustful of myself I ask, should I have been treated so at the Tuileries? This is my test." A great deal of pains has been taken by Napoleon's adherents and others to blacken the character of Sir Hudson Lowe, and to make it appear that his sole object was to harass Napoleon and to make his life miserable. Now, although it may be questioned whether Sir Hudson Lowe was the proper person to be placed in the delicate situation of guard over the fallen emperor, there is no doubt that quarrels and complaints began long before that officer reached the island. And the character of those complaints will show that at best the prisoners were persons very difficult to satisfy. Their detention at the Briars was one of the first causes of complaint. It was stated that the emperor was very ill there, that he was confined in a cage, with no attendants, that his suite was kept from him, and that he was deprived of exercise. A few pages farther in the Journal of Las Cases we find the emperor in good health, and as soon as it was announced that Longwood was ready to receive him, then it was urged that the jailers wished to compel him to go against his will. That they desired to push their authority to the utmost, that the smell of the paint at Longwood was very disagreeable, etc. Napoleon himself was quite ready to go, and seemed much vexed when Count Bertrand and General Gourgaud arrived from Longwood with the intelligence that the place was as yet uninhabitable. His displeasure, however, was much more seriously excited by the appearance of Count Montalon with the information that all was ready at Longwood within a few minutes after receiving the contrary accounts from Bertrand and Gourgaud. He probably perceived that he was trifled with by his attendants, who endeavored to make him believe that which suited their own convenience. We may also remark that the systematic opposition which was carried to such a great length against Sir Hudson Lowe had begun during the stay of Admiral Cockburn. His visits were refused. He was accused of caprice, arrogance, and impertinence, and he was nicknamed the Shark by Napoleon himself. His own calmness alone probably prevented more violent ebullitions. The wooden house arrived at last, and the governor waited on Napoleon to consult with him how and where it should be erected. Las Cases, who heard the dispute in an adjoining room, says that it was long and clamorous. He gives the details in Napoleon's own words. and we have here the advantage of comparing his statement with the account transmitted by Sir Hudson Lowe to the British government, dated May 17, 1816. The two accounts vary but little. Napoleon admits that he was thrown quite out of temper, that he received the governor with his stormy countenance, looked furiously at him, and made no reply to his information of the arrival of the house but by a significant look. He told him that he wanted nothing, nor would receive anything at his hands, that he supposed he was to be put to death by poison or the sword. The poison would be difficult to administer, but he had the means of doing it with the sword. The sanctuary of his abode should not be violated, and the troops should not enter his house but by trampling on his corpse. He then alluded to an invitation sent to him by Sir Hudson Lowe to meet Lady Loudon at his house, and said there could not be an act of more refined cruelty than inviting him to his table by the title of General. To make him an object of ridicule or amusement to his guests. What right had he to call him General Bonaparte? He would not be deprived of his dignity by him, nor by any one in the world. He certainly should have condescended to visit Lady Loudon had she been within his limits, as he did not stand upon strict etiquette with a woman, but he should have deemed that he was conferring an honor upon her. He would not consider himself a prisoner of war, but was placed in his present position by the most horrible breach of trust. After a few more words he dismissed the governor without once more alluding to the house which was the object of the visit. The fate of this unfortunate house may be mentioned here. It was erected after a great many disputes, but was unfortunately surrounded by a sunk fence and ornamental railing. This was immediately connected in Napoleon's mind with the idea of a fortification. It was impossible to remove the impression that the ditch and palisade were intended to secure his person. As soon as the objection was made known, Sir Hudson Lowe ordered the ground to be levelled and the rails taken away. But before this was quite completed, Napoleon's health was too much destroyed to permit his removal, and the house was never occupied. Napoleon seems to have felt that he had been too violent in his conduct. He admitted, when at table with his suite a few days after, that he had behaved very ill, and that in any other situation he should blush for what he had done. I could have wished, for his sake, he said, to see him evince a little anger, or pull the door violently after him when he went away. These few words let us into a good deal of Napoleon's character. He liked to intimidate, but his vehement language was received with a calmness and resolute forbearance to which he was quite unaccustomed. And he consequently grew more angry as his anger was less regarded. The specimens here given of the disputes with Sir Hudson Lowe may probably suffice. A great many more are furnished by Las Cases, O'Mara, and other partisans of Napoleon, and even they always make him the aggressor. Napoleon himself in his cooler moments seemed to admit this, after the most violent quarrel with the governor, that of the 18th of August, 1816, which utterly put an end to anything like decent civility between the parties. He allowed that he had used the governor very ill, that he repeatedly and purposely offended him, and that Sir Hudson Lowe had not in a single instance shown a want of respect, except perhaps that he retired too abruptly. Great complaints were made of the scanty way in which the table of the exiles was supplied, and it was again and again alleged by them that they had scarcely anything to eat. The wine, too, was said to be execrable, so bad that in fact it could not be drunk, and, of such stuff as it was, only 1 bottle a day was allowed to each person, an allowance which Las Cases calls ridiculously small. Thus pressed, but partly for effect, Napoleon resolved to dispose of his plate in monthly proportions. And as he knew that some East India captains had offered as much as 100 guineas for a single plate, in order to preserve a memorial of him, he determined that what was sold should be broken up, the arms erased, and no trace left which could show that they had ever been his. The only portions left uninjured were the little eagles with which some of the dish covers were mounted. These last fragments were objects of veneration for the attendants of Napoleon. They were looked upon as relics, with a feeling at once melancholy and religious. When the moment came for breaking up the plate, Las Cases bears testimony to the painful emotions and real grief produced among the servants. They could not, without the utmost reluctance, bring themselves to apply the hammer to those objects of their veneration. The island of St. Helena was regularly visited by East India ships on the return voyage, which touched there to take in water, and to leave gunpowder for the use of the garrison. On such occasions there were always persons anxious to pay a visit to the renowned captive. The regulation of those visits was calculated to protect Napoleon from being annoyed by the idle curiosity of strangers, to which he professed a great aversion. Such persons as wished to wait upon him were, in the first place, obliged to apply to the governor, by whom their names were forwarded to Count Bertrand. This gentleman, as Grand Marshal of the household, communicated the wishes of those persons to Napoleon, and in case of a favorable reply fixed the hour for an interview. Those visitors whom Napoleon admitted were chiefly persons of rank and distinction, travelers from distant countries, or men who had distinguished themselves in the scientific world, and who could communicate interesting information in exchange for the gratification they received. Some of those persons who were admitted to interviews with him have published narratives of their conversation, and all agree in extolling the extreme grace, propriety, and appearance of benevolence manifested by Bonaparte while holding these levees. His questions were always put with great tact, and on some subject with which the person interrogated was well acquainted, so as to induce him to bring forth any new or curious information of which he might be possessed. Captain Basil Hall, in August 1817, when in command of the Lyra, had an interview with the emperor, of whom he says, "Bonaparte struck me as differing considerably from the pictures and busts I had seen of him. His face and figure looked much broader and more square, larger, indeed, in every way than any representation I had met with. His corpulency, at this time universally reported to be excessive, was by no means remarkable. His flesh looked, on the contrary, firm and muscular. There was not the least trace of color in his cheeks, in fact his skin was more like marble than ordinary flesh. Not the smallest trace of a wrinkle was discernible on his brow, nor an approach to a furrow on any part of his countenance. His health and spirits, judging from appearances, were excellent, though at this period it was generally believed in England that he was fast sinking under a complication of diseases, and that his spirits were entirely gone. His manner of speaking was rather slow than otherwise, and perfectly distinct. He waited with great patience and kindness for my answers to his questions, and a reference to Count Bertrand was necessary only once during the whole conversation. The brilliant and sometimes dazzling expression of his eye could not be overlooked. It was not, however, a permanent luster, for it was only remarkable when he was excited by some point of particular interest. It is impossible to imagine an expression of more entire mildness, I may almost call it of benignity and kindness, than that which played over his features during the whole interview. If, therefore he were at this time out of health and in low spirits, his power of self-command must have been even more extraordinary than is generally supposed, for his whole deportment, his conversation, and the expression of his countenance indicated a frame in perfect health and a mind at ease. The manner assumed by Napoleon in the occasional interviews he had with such visitors was so very opposite to that which he constantly maintained towards the authorities in whose custody he was placed, that we can scarcely doubt he was acting a part in one of those situations. It was suggested by Mr. Ellis that he either wished, by means of his continual complaints, to keep alive his interest in England, where he flattered himself there was a party favourable to him, or that his troubled mind found an occupation in the annoyance which he caused to the governor. Every attempt at conciliation on the part of Sir Hudson Lowe furnished fresh causes for irritation. He sent fowling pieces to Longwood, and the thanks returned were a reply from Napoleon that it was an insult to send fowling pieces where there was no game. An invitation to a ball was resented vehemently, and descanted upon by the French party as a great offence. Sir Hudson Lowe at one time sent a variety of clothes and other articles received from England which he imagined might be useful at Longwood. Great offence was taken at this, they were treated, they said, like paupers. The articles ought to have been left at the governor's house, and a list sent respectfully to the household, stating that such things were at their command if they wanted them. An opinion has already been expressed that much of this annoyance was due to the offended pride of Napoleon's attendants, who were at first certainly far more captious than himself. He admitted as much himself on one occasion in a conversation with O'Mara. He said, Las Cases certainly was greatly irritated against Sir Hudson, and contributed materially towards forming the impressions existing in my mind. He attributed this to the sensitive mind of Las Cases, which he said was peculiarly alive to the ill treatment Napoleon and himself had been subjected to. Sir Hudson Lowe also felt this, and remarked, like Sir George Cockburn, on more than one occasion, that he always found Napoleon himself more reasonable than the persons about him. A fertile source of annoyance was the resolution of Napoleon not upon any terms to acknowledge himself a prisoner, and his refusal to submit to such regulations as would render his captivity less burdensome. More than once the attendance of an officer was offered to be discontinued if he would allow himself to be seen once every day, and promised to take no means of escaping. "If he were to give me the whole of the island," said Napoleon, "on condition that I would pledge my word not to attempt an escape, I would not accept it. Because it would be equivalent to acknowledging myself a prisoner, although at the same time I would not make the attempt. I am here by force, and not by right. If I had been taken at Waterloo perhaps I might have had no hesitation in accepting it, although even in that case it would be contrary to the law of nations, as now there is no war. If they were to offer me permission to reside in England on similar conditions I would refuse it." The very idea of exhibiting himself to an officer every day, though but for a moment, was repelled with indignation. He even kept loaded pistols to shoot any person who should attempt an intrusion on his privacy. It is stated in a note in O'Mara's journal that the Emperor was so firmly impressed with the idea that an attempt would be made forcibly to intrude on his privacy, that from a short time after the departure of Sir George Cockburn he always kept 4 or 5 pairs of loaded pistols and some swords in his apartment, with which he was determined to dispatch the first who entered against his will. It seems this practice was continued to his death. Napoleon continued to pass the mornings in dictating his memoirs and the evenings in reading or conversation. He grew fonder of Racine, but his favorite was Corneille. He repeated that, had he lived in his time, he would have made him a prince. He had a distaste to Voltaire, and found considerable fault with his dramas, perhaps justly, as conveying opinions rather than sentiments. He criticized his Mahomet, and said he had made him merely an impostor and a tyrant, without representing him as a great man. This was owing to Voltaire's religious and political antipathies. For those who are free from common prejudices acquire others of their own in their stead, to which they are equally bigoted, and which they bring forward on all occasions. When the evening passed off in conversation without having recourse to books he considered it a point gained. Someone having asked the Emperor which was the greatest battle that he had fought, he replied it was difficult to answer that question without inquiring what was implied by the greatest battle. "Mine," continued he, "cannot be judged of separately, they formed a portion of extensive plans. They must therefore be estimated by their consequences. The Battle of Marengo, which was so long undecided, procured for us the command of all Italy. Ulm annihilated a whole army, Jena laid the whole Prussian monarchy at our feet, Friedland opened the Russian Empire to us, and Eckmold decided the fate of a war. The Battle of the Moskwa was that in which the greatest talent was displayed, and by which we obtained the fewest advantages. Waterloo, where everything failed, would, had victory crowned our efforts, have saved France and given peace to Europe." Madame Montholon having inquired what troops he considered the best, "Those which are victorious, madam," replied the Emperor. "But," added he, "soldiers are capricious and inconstant, like you ladies. The best troops were the Carthaginians under Hannibal, the Romans under the Scipios, the Macedonians under Alexander, and the Prussians under Frederick." He thought, however, that the French soldiers were of all others those which could most easily be rendered the best, and preserved so. "With my complete guard of 40,000 or 50,000 men I would have undertaken to march through Europe. It is perhaps possible to produce troops as good as those that composed my army of Italy and Austerlitz, but certainly none can ever surpass them." The anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo produced a visible impression on the Emperor. "Incomprehensible day," said he, dejectedly, "concurrence of unheard of fatalities. Grouchy, nay, Durlin, was there treachery or was it merely misfortune? Alas! Poor France!" Here he covered his eyes with his hands. "And yet," said he, all that human skill could do was accomplished. All was not lost until the moment when all had succeeded. A short time afterwards, resuming the subject, he exclaimed, "In that extraordinary campaign, thrice, in less than a week, I saw the certain triumph of France slip through my fingers. Had it not been for a traitor I should have annihilated the enemy at the outset of the campaign. I should have destroyed him at Ligny if my left wing had only done its duty. I should have destroyed him again at Waterloo if my right had seconded me. Singular defeat, by which, notwithstanding the most fatal catastrophe, the glory of the conquered has not suffered." We shall here give Napoleon's own opinion of the Battle of Waterloo. "The plan of the battle," said he, "will not in the eyes of the historian reflect any credit on Lord Wellington as a general. In the first place, he ought not to have given battle with the armies divided. They ought to have been united and encamped before the 15th. In the next, the choice of ground was bad, because if he had been beaten he could not have retreated, as there was only one road leading through the forest in his rear. He also committed a fault which might have proved the destruction of all his army, without its ever having commenced the campaign, or being drawn out in battle. He allowed himself to be surprised. On the 15th I was at Charleroi, and had beaten the Prussians without his knowing anything about it. I had gained 48 hours of maneuvers upon him, which was a great object. And if some of my generals had shown that vigor and genius which they had displayed on other occasions, I should have taken his army in cantonments without ever fighting a battle. But they were discouraged, and fancied that they saw an army of 100,000 men everywhere opposed to them. I had not time enough myself to attend to the minutiae of the army. I counted upon surprising and cutting Wellington up in detail. I knew of Bülow's arrival at 11 o'clock, but I did not regard it. I had still 80 chances out of 100 in my favor. Notwithstanding the great superiority of force against me, I was convinced that I should obtain the victory. I had about 70,000 men, of whom 15,000 were cavalry. I had also 260 pieces of cannon. But my troops were so good that I esteemed them sufficient to beat 120,000. Of all those troops, however, I only reckoned the English as being able to cope with my own. The others I thought little of. I believe that of English there were from 35,000 to 40,000. These I esteemed to be as brave and as good as my own troops. The English army was well known latterly on the continent, and besides, your nation possesses courage and energy. As to the Prussians, Belgians, and others, half the number of my troops were sufficient to beat them. I only left 34,000 men to take care of the Prussians. The chief causes of the loss of that battle were, first of all, Grouchy's great tardiness and neglect in executing his orders. Next, the grenadiers of Cheval, and the cavalry under General Guillot, which I had in reserve, and which were never to leave me, engaged without orders and without my knowledge. So that after the last charge, when the troops were beaten and the English cavalry advanced, I had not a single corps of cavalry in reserve to resist them, instead of one which I esteemed to be equal to double their own number. In consequence of this the English attacked, succeeded, and all was lost. There was no means of rallying. The youngest general would not have committed the fault of leaving an army entirely without reserve, which, however, occurred here, whether in consequence of treason or not I cannot say. These were the two principal causes of the loss of the Battle of Waterloo. If Lord Wellington had entrenched himself, continued Napoleon, I would not have attacked him. As a general, his plan did not show talent. He certainly displayed great courage and obstinacy, but a little must be taken away even from that when you consider that he had no means of retreat, and that had he made the attempt not a man of his army would have escaped. First, to the firmness and bravery of his troops, for the English fought with the greatest courage and obstinacy, he is principally indebted for the victory, and not to his own conduct as a general. And next, to the arrival of Blücher, to whom the victory is more to be attributed than to Wellington, and more credit is due as a general, because he, although beaten the day before, assembled his troops, and brought them into action in the evening. I believe, however, continued Napoleon, that Wellington is a man of great firmness. The glory of such a victory is a great thing, but in the eye of the historian his military reputation will gain nothing by it. I always had a high opinion of your seamen, said Napoleon one day to O'Mara, in a conversation arising out of the expedition to Algiers. When I was returning from Holland along with the Empress Maria Louisa, we stopped to rest at Givet. During the night a violent storm of wind and rain came on, which swelled the Meuse so much that the bridge of boats over it was carried away. I was very anxious to depart, and ordered all the boatmen in the place to be assembled that I might be enabled to cross the river. They said that the waters were so high that it would be impossible to pass before 2 or 3 days. I questioned some of them, and soon discovered that they were freshwater seamen. I then recollected that there were English prisoners in the barracks, and ordered that some of the oldest and best seamen among them should be brought before me to the banks of the river. The waters were very high, and the current rapid and dangerous. I asked them if they could join a number of boats together so that I might pass over. They answered that it was possible, but hazardous. I desired them to set about it instantly. In the course of a few hours they succeeded in effecting what the others had pronounced to be impossible, and I crossed before the evening was over. I ordered those who had worked at it to receive a sum of money each, a suit of clothes, and their liberty. Marchand was with me at the time. In December 1816 Las Cases was compelled to leave St. Helena. He had written a letter to Lucien Bonaparte, and entrusted it to a mulatto servant to be forwarded to Europe. He was detected. And as he was thus endeavoring to carry on, contrary to the regulations of the island, a clandestine correspondence with Europe, Las Cases and his son were sent off, first to the Cape and then to England, where they were only allowed to land to be sent to Dover and shipped off to Ostend. Not long after their arrival at St. Helena, Madame Bertrand gave birth to a son, and when Napoleon went to visit her she said, "I have the honor of presenting to your Majesty the first French subject who has entered Longwood without the permission of Lord Bathurst." It has been generally supposed that Napoleon was a believer in the doctrine of predestination. The following conversation with Las Cases clearly decides that point. "Pray," said he, "am I not thought to be given to a belief in predestination?" "Yes, sire, at least by many people." "Well, well. Let them say what they please, one may sometimes be tempted to set apart, and it may occasionally be useful. But what are men? How much easier is it to occupy their attention and to strike their imaginations by absurdities than by rational ideas? But can a man of sound sense listen for one moment to such a doctrine? Either predestination admits the existence of free will, or it rejects it. If it admits it, what kind of predetermined result can that be which a simple resolution, a step, a word, may alter or modify ad infinitum? If predestination, on the contrary, rejects the existence of free will, it is quite another question. In that case a child need only be thrown into its cradle as soon as it is born, there is no necessity for bestowing the least care upon it, for if it be irrevocably decreed that it is to live, it will grow though no food should be given to it. You see that such a doctrine cannot be maintained, predestination is but a word without meaning. The Turks themselves, the professors of predestination, are not convinced of the doctrine, for in that case medicine would not exist in Turkey, and a man residing in a third floor would not take the trouble of going downstairs, but would immediately throw himself out of the window. You see to what a string of absurdities that will lead? The following traits are characteristic of the man. In the common intercourse of life, and his familiar conversation, Napoleon mutilated the names most familiar to him, even French names. Yet this would not have occurred on any public occasion. He has been heard many times during his walks to repeat the celebrated speech of Augustus in Corneille's tragedy, and he has never missed saying, "Take a seat, Sylla," instead of Cinna. He would frequently create names according to his fancy, and when he had once adopted them they remained fixed in his mind, although they were pronounced properly 100 times a day in his hearing. But he would have been struck if others had used them as he had altered them. It was the same thing with respect to orthography. In general he did not attend to it, yet if the copies which were made contained any faults of spelling he would have complained of it. One day Napoleon said to Las Cases, "Your orthography is not correct, is it?" This question gave occasion to a sarcastic smile from a person who stood near, who thought it was meant to convey a reproach. The emperor, who saw this, continued, "At least I suppose it is not, for a man occupied with important public business, a minister, for instance, cannot and need not attend to orthography. His ideas must flow faster than his hand can trace them, he has only time to dwell upon essentials, he must put words in letters, and phrases in words, and let the scribes make it out afterwards." Napoleon indeed left a great deal for the copyists to do, he was their torment, his handwriting actually resembled hieroglyphics, he often could not decipher it himself. Las Cases' son was one day reading to him a chapter of the campaign of Italy. On a sudden he stopped short, unable to make out the writing. "The little blockhead," said Napoleon, "cannot read his own handwriting." "It is not mine, sire." "And whose, then?" "Your Majesty's." "How so, you little rogue? Do you mean to insult me?" The emperor took the manuscript, tried a long while to read it, and at last threw it down, saying, "He is right, I cannot tell myself what is written." He has often sent the copyists to Las Cases to read what he had himself been unable to decipher. We are now approaching the last melancholy epoch of Napoleon's life, when he first felt the ravages of that malady which finally put a period to his existence. Occasional manifestations of its presence have been exhibited for some years, but his usual health always returned after every attack, and its fatal nature was not suspected. Although Napoleon himself had several times said that he should die of a serous in the pylorus, the disease which killed his father, and which the physicians of Montpellier declared would be hereditary in his family. About the middle of the year 1818 it was observed that his health grew gradually worse, and it was thought proper by O'Meara to report to the governor the state in which he was. Even on these occasions Napoleon seized the opportunity for renewing his claim to the title of emperor. He insisted that the physician should not send any bulletin whatever unless he named him in it by his imperial designation. O'Meara explained that the instructions of his government and the orders of Sir Hudson Lowe prohibited him from using the term, but it was in vain. After some difficulty it was agreed upon that the word patient should be used instead of the title of general, which caused so much offense, and this substitution got rid of the difficulty. O'Meara afterwards proposed to call in the assistance of Dr. Baxter, the principal medical officer of the island, but this offer Napoleon refused at once, alleging that, although it was true he looked like an honest man, he was too much attached to that hangman, Lowes. He also persisted in rejecting the aid of medicine, and determined to take no exercise out of doors as long as he should be subjected to the challenge of sentinels. To a representation that his determination might convert a curable to a fatal malady, he replied, "I shall at least have the consolation that my death will be an eternal dishonor to the English nation who sent me to this climate to die under the hands of." An important incident in Napoleon's monotonous life was the removal of O'Meara, who had attended him as his physician from the time of his arrival on the island. The removal of this gentleman was occasioned by the suspicion of similar conduct to that which brought about the dismissal of Las Cases 20 months previously, namely, the carrying on secret correspondence with persons out of the island. Napoleon complained bitterly of the loss of his medical attendant, though he had most assuredly very seldom attended to his advice, and repelled as an insult the proffered assistance of Dr. Baxter, insinuating that the governor wished to have his life in his power. Some time after Dr. Stokes, a naval surgeon, was called in, but withdrawn and eventually tried by court-martial for furnishing information to the French at Longwood. After this Napoleon expressed his determination to admit no more visits from any English physician whatever, and Cardinal Fesch was requested by the British ministry to select some physician of reputation in Italy who should be sent to St. Helena to attend on Napoleon. The choice fell on Dr. Antomarchi, a young surgeon, who was accordingly sent to St. Helena in company with 2 Catholic priests, the Abbés Buonavita and Vignal, and 2 domestics, in compliance with the wish of Napoleon to that effect. The party reached the island on September 10, 1819. On his first visit the emperor overwhelmed Antomarchi with questions concerning his mother and family, the Princess Julie, wife of Joseph, and Las Cases, whom Antomarchi had seen in passing through Frankfurt. Expatiated with satisfaction on the retreat which he had at one time meditated in Corsica, entered into some discussions with the doctor on his profession, and then directed his attention to the details of his disorder. While he examined the symptoms, the emperor continued his remarks. They were sometimes serious, sometimes lively. Kindness, indignation, gaiety, were expressed by turns in his words and in his countenance. "Well, doctor," he exclaimed, "what is your opinion? Am I to trouble much longer the digestion of kings? You will survive them, sire. I believe you. They will not be able to subject to the ban of Europe the fame of our victories, it will traverse ages, it will proclaim the conquerors and the conquered, those who were generous and those who were not so. Posterity will judge, I do not dread its decision. This afterlife belongs to you of right. Your name will never be repeated with admiration without recalling those inglorious warriors so basely leagued against a single man. But you are not near your end, you have yet a long career to run. No, doctor. I cannot hold out long under this frightful climate. Your excellent constitution is proof against its pernicious effects. It once did not yield to the strength of mind with which nature has endowed me, but the transition from a life of action to a complete seclusion has ruined all. I have grown fat, my energy is gone, the bow is unstrung. Antomarchi did not try to combat an opinion but too well founded, but diverted the conversation to another subject. I resign myself, said Napoleon, to your direction. Let medicine give the order, I submit to its decisions. I entrust my health to your care. I owe you the detail of the habits I have acquired, of the affections to which I am subject. The hours at which I obey the injunctions of nature are in general extremely irregular. I sleep, I eat according to circumstances or the situation in which I am placed, my sleep is ordinarily sound and tranquil. If pain or any accident interrupted, I jump out of bed, call for a light, walk, set to work, and fix my attention on some subject. Sometimes I remain in the dark, change my apartment, lie down in another bed, or stretch myself on the sofa. I rise at 2, 3, or 4 in the morning, I call for someone to keep me company, amuse myself with recollections or business, and wait for the return of day. I go out as soon as dawn appears, take a stroll, and when the sun shows itself I re-enter and go to bed again, where I remain a longer or shorter time, according as the day promises to turn out. If it is bad, and I feel irritation and uneasiness, I have recourse to the method I have just mentioned. I change my posture, pass from my bed to the sofa, from the sofa to the bed, seek and find a degree of freshness. I do not describe to you my morning costume, it has nothing to do with the sufferings I endure, and besides, I do not wish to deprive you of the pleasure of your surprise when you see it. These ingenious contrivances carry me on to 9 or 10 o'clock, sometimes later. I then order the breakfast to be brought, which I take from time to time in my bath, but most frequently in the garden. Either Bertrand or Montholin keep me company, often both of them. Physicians have the right of regulating the table, it is proper that I should give you an account of mine. Well, then, a basin of soup, 2 plates of meat, 1 of vegetables, a salad when I can take it, compose the whole service, half a bottle of claret, which I dilute with a good deal of water, serves me for drink. I drink a little of it pure towards the end of the repast. Sometimes, when I feel fatigued, I substitute champagne for claret, it is a certain means of giving a fillip to the stomach. The doctor having expressed his surprise at Napoleon's temperance, he replied, in my marches with the army of Italy I never failed to put into the bow of my saddle a bottle of wine, some bread, and a cold fowl. This provision sufficed for the wants of the day, I may even say that I often shared it with others. I thus gain time. I eat fast, masticate little, my meals do not consume my hours. This is not what you will approve the most, but in my present situation what signifies it? I am attacked with a liver complaint, a malady which is general in this horrible climate. Antomarchi, having gained his confidence, now became companion as well as physician to the emperor, and sometimes read with him. He eagerly turned over the newspapers when they arrived, and commented freely on their contents. It is amusing, he would say, to see the sage measures resorted to by the Allies to make people forget my tyranny. On one occasion he felt more languid than ordinary, and lighting on the Andromache of Racine. He took up the book, began to read, but soon let it drop from his hands. He had come to the famous passage where the mother describes her being allowed to see her son once a day. He was moved, covered his face with his hands, and, saying that he was too much affected, desired to be left alone. He grew calmer, fell asleep, and when he awoke, desired Antomarchi to be called again. He was getting ready to shave, and the doctor was curious to witness the operation. He was in his shirt, his head uncovered, with two valets at his side, one holding the glass and the towel, the other the rest of the apparatus. The emperor spread the soap over one side of his face, put down the brush, wiped his hands and mouth, took a razor dipped in hot water and shaved the right side with singular dexterity. "Is it done, Navarrese?" "Yes, sire." "Well, then, face about. Come, villain, quick, stand still." The light fell on the left side, which, after applying the lather, he shaved in the same manner and with the same dexterity. He drew his hand over his chin. "Raise the glass. Am I quite right?" "Quite so. Not a hair has escaped me, what say you?" "No, sire," replied the valet de chambre. "No. I think I perceive one. Lift up the glass, place it in a better light." "How, rascal? Flattery. You deceive me at St. Helena. On this rock. You, too, are an accomplice." With this he gave them both a box on the ear, laughed, and joked in the most pleasant manner possible. An almost incredible instance of the determination of the exiles to make as many enemies as they possibly could was exhibited to Antomarchi on his arrival at Longwood. He states that before he was permitted to enter on his functions as surgeon he was required to take an oath that he would not communicate with the English, and that he would more especially avoid giving them the least information respecting the progress of Napoleon's disorder. He was not allowed to see his illustrious patient until the oath was taken. After exacting such an oath from his physician, the attendants of Bonaparte had little right to complain, as they did, that the real state of his disorder was purposely concealed from the world by the English government. It is more than probable that the constant attempts observed to throw mystery and secrecy around them must have tended to create the suspicion of escape, and to increase the consequent rigor of the regulations maintained by the governor. Soon after the arrival of the priests Napoleon determined, we may suppose partly in jest, to elevate one of them to the dignity of bishop, and he chose for a diocese the Jumna. The last box brought from Europe had been broken open, says Antomarchi. It contained the vases and church ornaments. "Stop," said Napoleon, "this is the property of St. Peter, have a care who touches it. Send for the abbés, but talking of the abbés, do you know that the Cardinal, Fesch, is a poor creature? He sends me missionaries and propagandists, as if I were a penitent, and as if a whole string of their eminences had not always attended at my chapel. I will do what he ought to have done, I possess the right of investiture, and I shall use it. Abbé Buonavita was just entering the room, I give you the episcopal mitre. Sire, I restore it to you, you shall wear it in spite of the heretics, they will not again take it from you. But, sire, I cannot add to it so rich a benefice as that of Valencia, which Suchet had given you, but at any rate your see shall be secure from the chances of battles. I appoint you bishop of, let me see, of the Jumna. The vast countries through which that river flows were on the point of entering into alliance with me, all was in readiness, all were going to march. We were about to give the finishing blow to England. The speech concluded with an order to Count Montholon to procure the necessary dress for the abbé in order to strike with all the heretics. The upshot of the whole was, that the scarlet and violet-colored clothes necessary to furnish the new bishop with the only valuable portion of his temporalities, his dress, could not be procured in the island. And the abbé remained an abbé in spite of the investiture, and the whole farce was forgotten. We occasionally see the exile in better moods, when he listened to the voice of reason, and thought less of the annoyances inseparable from the state to which his ambition, or as he himself always averred, his destiny, had reduced him. He had for a long time debarred himself from all exercise, having, as he expressed it, determined not to expose himself to the insult of being accompanied on his ride by a British officer, or the possibility of being challenged by a sentinel. One day when he complained of his inactive life, his medical attendant recommended the exercise of digging the ground. The idea was instantly seized upon by Napoleon with his characteristic ardor. Narvaez, his chasseur, who had been formerly accustomed to rural occupations, was honored with the title of head gardener, and under his directions Napoleon proceeded to work with great vigor. He sent for Antomarchi to witness his newly acquired dexterity in the use of the spade. "Well, doctor," said he to him, "are you satisfied with your patient? Is he obedient enough? This is better than your pills, Dotaracho. You shall not physic me any more." At first he soon got fatigued, and complained much of the weakness of his body and delicacy of his hands. "But, never mind," said he, "I have always accustomed my body to bend to my will, and I shall bring it to do so now, and inure it to the exercise." He soon grew fond of his new employment, and pressed all the inhabitants of Longwood into the service. Even the ladies had great difficulty to avoid being set to work. He laughed at them, urged them, entreated them, and used all his arts of persuasion, particularly with Madame Bertrand. He assured her that the exercise of gardening was much better than all the doctor's prescriptions, that it was in fact one of his prescriptions. But in this instance his eloquence failed in its effect, and he was obliged, though with much reluctance, to desist from his attempts to make lady gardeners. But in recompense he had willing laborers on the part of the gentlemen. Antomarchi says, "The emperor urged us, excited us, and everything around us soon assumed a different aspect. Here was an excavation, there a basin or a road. We made alleys, grottos, cascades. The appearance of the ground had now some life and diversity. We planted willows, oaks, peach trees, to give a little shade round the house. Having completed the ornamental part of our labors we turned to the useful. We divided the ground, we manured it, and sowed it with abundance of beans, peas, and every vegetable that grows in the island." In the course of their labors they found that a tank would be of great use to hold water, which might be brought by pipes from a spring at a distance of 3,000 feet. For this laborious attempt it was absolutely necessary to procure additional forces, and a party of Chinese, of whom there are many on the island, was engaged to help them. These people were much amused at Napoleon's working dress, which was a jacket and large trousers, with an enormous straw hat to shield him from the sun, and sandals. He pitied those poor fellows who suffered from the heat of the sun, and made each of them a present of a large hat like his own. After much exertion the basin was finished, the pipes laid, and the water began to flow into it. Napoleon stocked his pond with goldfish, which he placed in it with his own hands. He would remain by the pond for hours together, at a time when he was so weak that he could hardly support himself. He would amuse himself by following the motion of the fishes, throwing bread to them, studying their ways, taking an interest in their loves and their quarrels, and endeavoring with anxiety to find out points of resemblance between their motives and those of mankind. He often sent for his attendants to communicate his remarks to them, and directed their observations to any peculiarities he had observed. His favorites at last sickened, they struggled, floated on the water, and died one after another. He was deeply affected by this, and remarked to Antomarchi, "You see very well that there is a fatality attached to me. Everything I love, everything that belongs to me, is immediately struck, heaven and mankind unite to persecute me." From this time he visited them daily in spite of sickness or bad weather, nor did his anxiety diminish until it was discovered that a coppery cement, with which the bottom of the basin was plastered, had poisoned the water. The fish which were not yet dead were then taken out and put into a tub. Napoleon appears to have taken peculiar interest in observing the instincts of animals, and comparing their practices and propensities with those of men. A rainy day, during which the digging of the tank could not be proceeded with, gave occasion for some observations on the actions of a number of ants, which had made a way into his bedroom, climbed upon a table on which some sugar usually stood, and taken possession of the sugar basin. He would not allow the industrious little insects to be disturbed in their plans, but he now and then moved the sugar, followed their maneuvers, and admired the activity and industry they displayed until they found it again. This they had been sometimes even 2 or 3 days in effecting, though they always succeeded at last. He then surrounded the basin with water, but the ants still reached it. He finally employed vinegar, and the insects were unable to get through the new obstacle. But the slight activity of mind that now remained to him was soon to be exchanged for the languor and gloom of sickness, with but few intervals between positive suffering and the most distressing lowness of spirits. Towards the end of the year 1820 he walked with difficulty, and required assistance even to reach a chair in his garden. He became nearly incapable of the slightest action, his legs swelled, the pains in his side and back were increased. He was troubled with nausea, profuse sweats, loss of appetite, and was subject to frequent faintings. "Here I am, doctor," said he one day, "at my last cast. No more energy and strength left, I bend under the load. I am going. I feel that my hour is come." Some days after, as he lay on his couch, he feelingly expressed to Antomarchi the vast change which had taken place within him. He recalled for a few moments the vivid recollection of past times, and compared his former energy with the weakness which he was then sinking under. The news of the death of his sister Elisa also affected him deeply. After a struggle with his feelings, which had nearly overpowered him, he rose, supported himself on Antomarchi's arm, and regarding him steadfastly, said, "Well, doctor. You see, Elisa has just shown me the way. Death, which seemed to have forgotten my family, has begun to strike it, my turn cannot be far off. What think you? Your Majesty is in no danger, you are still reserved for some glorious enterprise." "Ah, doctor. I have neither strength nor activity nor energy, I am no longer Napoleon. You strive in vain to give me hopes, to recall life ready to expire. Your care can do nothing in spite of fate, it is immovable, there is no appeal from its decisions. The next person of our family who will follow Elisa to the tomb is that great Napoleon who hardly exists, who bends under the yoke, and who still, nevertheless keeps Europe in alarm. Behold, my good friend, how I look on my situation. As for me, all is over, I repeat it to you, my days will soon close on this miserable rock." We returned, says Antomarchi, into his chamber. Napoleon lay down, in bed. "Close my windows," he said, "leave me to myself. I will send for you by and by. What a delightful thing rest is! I would not exchange it for all the thrones in the world. What an alteration! How I am fallen! I, whose activity was boundless, whose mind never slumbered, am now plunged into a lethargic stupor, so that it requires an effort even to raise my eyelids. I sometimes dictated to 4 or 5 secretaries, who wrote as fast as words could be uttered, but then I was Napoleon, now I am no longer anything. My strength, my faculties forsake me. I do not live, I merely exist." From this period the existence of Napoleon was evidently drawing to a close, his days were counted. Whole hours, and even days, were either passed in gloomy silence or spent in pain, accompanied by distressing coughs, and all the melancholy signs of the approach of death. He made a last effort to ride a few miles round Longwood on the 22d of January 1821, but it exhausted his strength, and from that time his only exercise was in the calash. Even that slight motion soon became too fatiguing. He now kept his room, and no longer stirred out. His disorder and his weakness increased upon him. He still was able to eat something, but very little, and with a worse appetite than ever. "Ah! Doctor," he exclaimed, "how I suffer! Why did the cannonballs spare me only to die in this deplorable manner? I that was so active, so alert, can now scarcely raise my eyelids." His last airing was on the 17th of March. The disease increased, and Antomarchi, who was much alarmed, obtained with some difficulty permission to see an English physician. He held a consultation, on the 26th of March, with Dr. Arnott of the 20th Regiment. But Napoleon still refused to take medicine, and often repeated his favorite saying, "Everything that must happen is written down, our hour is marked," and it is not in our power to take from time a portion which nature refuses us. He continued to grow worse, and at last consented to see Dr. Arnott, whose first visit was on the 1st of April. He was introduced into the chamber of the patient, which was darkened, and into which Napoleon did not suffer any light to be brought, examined his pulse and the other symptoms, and was requested to repeat his visit the next day. Napoleon was now within a month of his death, and although he occasionally spoke with the eloquence and vehemence he had so often exhibited, his mind was evidently giving way. The reported appearance of a comet was taken as a token of his death. He was excited, and exclaimed with emotion, "A comet! That was the precursor of the death of Caesar." On the 3d of April the symptoms of the disorder had become so alarming that Antomarchi informed Bertrand and Montholon he thought Napoleon's danger imminent, and that Napoleon ought to take steps to put his affairs in order. He was now attacked by fever and by violent thirst, which often interrupted his sleep in the night. On the 14th Napoleon found himself in better spirits, and talked with Dr. Arnott on the merits of Marlborough, whose campaigns he desired him to present to the 20th Regiment, learning that they did not possess a copy in their library. On the 15th of April Napoleon's doors were closed to all but Montholon and Marchand, and it appeared that he had been making his will. On the 19th he was better, was free from pain, sat up, and ate a little. He was in good spirits, and wished them to read to him. As General Montholon with the others expressed his satisfaction at this improvement he smiled gently, and said, "You deceive yourselves, my friends. I am, it is true, somewhat better, but I feel no less that my end draws near. When I am dead you will have the agreeable consolation of returning to Europe. One will meet his relations, another his friends, and as for me, I shall behold my brave companions in arms in the Elysian fields. Yes," he went on, raising his voice, "Kleber, Desaix, Bessières, Duroc, Ney, Marat, Messina, Berthier, all will come to greet me, they will talk to me of what we have done together. I will recount to them the latest events of my life. On seeing me they will become once more intoxicated with enthusiasm and glory. We will discourse of our wars with the Scipios, Hannibal, Caesar, and Frederick. There will be a satisfaction in that, unless," he added, laughing bitterly, "they should be alarmed below to see so many warriors assembled together." He addressed Dr. Arnott, who came in while he was speaking, on the treatment he had received from England said that she had violated every sacred right in making him prisoner, that he should have been much better treated in Russia, Austria, or even Prussia. That he was sent to the horrible rock of St. Helena on purpose to die, that he had been purposely placed on the most uninhabitable spot of that inhospitable island, and kept 6 years a close prisoner, and that Sir Hudson Lowe was his executioner. He concluded with these words, "You will end like the proud Republic of Venice. And I, dying upon this dreary rock, away from those I hold dear, and deprived of everything, bequeath the opprobrium and horror of my death to the reigning family of England." On the 21st Napoleon gave directions to the priest who was in attendance as to the manner in which he would be placed to lie in state after his death. And finding his religious attendant had never officiated in such a solemnity he gave the most minute instructions for the mode of conducting it. He afterwards declared that he would die, as he was born a Catholic, and desired that Mass should be said by his body, and the customary ceremonies should be performed every day until his burial. The expression of his face was earnest and convulsive. He saw Antomarchi watching the contractions which he underwent, when his eye caught some indication that displeased him. "You are above these weaknesses, but what would you have? I am neither philosopher nor physician. I believe in God, I am of the religion of my fathers, every one cannot be an atheist who pleases." Then turning to the priest, "I was born in the Catholic religion. I wish to fulfill the duties which it imposes, and to receive the succor which it administers. You will say Mass every day in the adjoining chapel, and you will expose the Holy Sacrament for 40 hours. After I am dead you will place your altar at my head in the funeral chamber, you will continue to celebrate Mass, and perform all the customary ceremonies, you will not cease till I am laid in the ground." The Abbé Vignal withdrew. Napoleon reproved his fellow countrymen for his supposed incredulity. "Can you carry it to this point? Can you disbelieve in God? Everything proclaims his existence, and, besides, the greatest minds have thought so. But, sire, I have never called it in question. I was attending to the progress of the fever. Your Majesty fancied you saw in my features an expression which they had not. You are a physician, doctor, he replied laughingly. These folks, he added, half to himself, are conversant only with matter, they will believe in nothing beyond. In the afternoon of the 25th he was better, but being left alone, a sudden fancy possessed him to eat. He called for fruits, wine, tried a biscuit, then swallowed some champagne, seized a bunch of grapes, and burst into a fit of laughter as soon as he saw Antomarchi return. The physician ordered away the dessert, and found fault with the maître d'hôtel, but the mischief was done, the fever returned and became violent. The emperor was now on his deathbed, but he testified concern for every one. He asked Antomarchi if 500 guineas would satisfy the English physician, and if he himself would like to serve Maria Louisa in quality of a physician. She is my wife, the first princess in Europe, and after me you should serve no one else. Antomarchi expressed his acknowledgments. The fever continued unabated, with violent thirst and cold in the feet. On the 27th he determined to remove from the small chamber into the salon. They were preparing to carry him. No, he said, not until I am dead, for the present it will be sufficient if you support me. Between the 27th and 28th the emperor passed a very bad night, the fever increased, coldness spread over his limbs, his strength was quite gone. He spoke a few words of encouragement to Antomarchi. Then in a tone of perfect calmness and composure he delivered to him the following instructions: after my death, which cannot be far off, I wish you to open my body, I wish also, nay, I require, that you will not suffer any English physician to touch me. If, however, you find it indispensable to have someone to assist you, Dr. Arnott is the only one I am willing you should employ. I am desirous, further, that you should take out my heart, that you put it in spirits of wine, and that you carry it to Parma to my dear Maria Louisa. You will tell her how tenderly I have loved her, that I have never ceased to love her. And you will report to her all that you have witnessed, all that relates to my situation and my death. I recommend you, above all, carefully to examine my stomach, to make an exact detailed report of it, which you will convey to my son. The vomitings which succeed each other without intermission lead me to suppose that the stomach is the one of my organs which is the most deranged. And I am inclined to believe that it is affected with the disease which conducted my father to the grave, I mean a cancer in the lower stomach. What think you? His physician hesitating, he continued, I have not doubted this since I found the sickness become frequent and obstinate. It is nevertheless well worthy of remark that I have always had a stomach of iron, that I have felt no inconvenience from this organ till latterly, and that whereas my father was fond of high-seasoned dishes and spirituous liquors, I have never been able to make use of them. Be it as it may, I entreat, I charge you to neglect nothing in such an examination, in order that when you see my son you may communicate the result of your observations to him, and point out the most suitable remedies. When I am no more you will repair to Rome, you will find out my mother and my family. You will give them an account of all you have observed relative to my situation, my disorder, and my death on this remote and miserable rock. You will tell them that the great Napoleon expired in the most deplorable state, wanting everything, abandoned to himself and his glory. It was 10 in the forenoon, after this the fever abated, and he fell into a sort of doze. The emperor passed a very bad night, and could not sleep. He grew light-headed and talked incoherently, still the fever had abated in its violence. Towards morning the hiccup began to torment him, the fever increased, and he became quite delirious. He spoke of his complaint, and called upon Baxter, the governor's physician, to appear, to come and see the truth of his reports. Then all at once fancying O'Mara present, he imagined a dialogue between them, throwing a weight of odium on the English policy. The fever having subsided, his hearing became distinct. He grew calm, and entered into some further conversation on what was to be done after his death. He felt thirsty, and drank a large quantity of cold water. If fate should determine that I shall recover, I would raise a monument on the spot where this water gushes out, I would crown the fountain in memory of the comfort which it has afforded me. If I die, and they should not proscribe my remains as they have proscribed my person, should desire to be buried with my ancestors in the cathedral of Ajaccio, in Corsica. But if I am not allowed to repose where I was born, why, then, let them bury me at the spot where this fine and refreshing water flows. This request was afterwards complied with. He remained nearly in the same state for some days. On the 1st of May he was delirious nearly all day, and suffered dreadful vomitings. He took 2 small biscuits and a few drops of red wine. On the 2d he was rather quieter, and the alarming symptoms diminished a little. At 2 p.m. however, he had a paroxysm of fever, and became again delirious. He talked to himself of France, of his dear son, of some of his old companions in arms. At times he was evidently in imagination on the field of battle. Stengel, he cried, Desaix. Messina. Ah! Victory is declaring itself. Run, rush forward, press the charge, they are ours. I was listening, says Dar. Antomarchi, and following the progress of that painful agony in the deepest distress, when Napoleon, suddenly collecting his strength, jumped on the floor, and would absolutely go down into the garden to take a walk. I ran to receive him in my arms, but his legs bent under the weight of his body, he fell backwards, and I had the mortification of being unable to prevent his falling. We raised him up and entreated him to get into bed again. But he did not recognize anybody, and began to storm and fall into a violent passion. He was unconscious, and anxiously desired to walk in the garden. In the course of the day, however, he became more collected, and again spoke of his disease, and the precise anatomical examination he wished to be made of his body after death. He had a fancy that this might be useful to his son. The physicians of Montpellier, he said to Antomarchi, announced that the sclerosis in the pylorus would be hereditary in my family. Their report is, I believe, in the hands of my brother Louis. Ask for it and compare it with your own observations on my case, in order that my son may be saved from this cruel disease. You will see him, doctor, and you will point out to him what is best to do, and will save him from the cruel sufferings I now experience. This is the last service I ask of you. Later in the day he said, Doctor, I am very ill, I feel that I am going to die. The last time Napoleon spoke, except to utter a few short unconnected words, was on the 3d of May. It was in the afternoon, and he had requested his attendants, in case of his losing consciousness, not to allow any English physician to approach him except Dr. Arnott. I am going to die, said he, and you to return to Europe. I must give you some advice as to the line of conduct you are to pursue. You have shared my exile, you will be faithful to my memory, and will not do anything that may injure it. I have sanctioned all proper principles, and infused them into my laws and acts, I have not omitted a single one. Unfortunately, however, the circumstances in which I was placed were arduous, and I was obliged to act with severity, and to postpone the execution of my plans. Our reverses occurred, I could not unbend the bow. And France has been deprived of the liberal institutions I intended to give her. She judges me with indulgence, she feels grateful for my intentions, she cherishes my name and my victories. Imitate her example, be faithful to the opinions we have defended, and to the glory we have acquired, any other course can only lead to shame and confusion. From this moment it does not appear that Napoleon showed any signs of understanding what was going forward around him. His weakness increased every moment, and a harassing hiccup continued until death took place. The day before that event a fearful tempest threatened to destroy everything about Longwood. The plantations were torn up by the roots, and it was particularly remarked that a willow, under which Napoleon usually sat to enjoy the fresh air, had fallen. It seemed, says Antomarchi, as if none of the things the emperor valued were to survive him. On the day of his death Madame Bertrand, who had not left his bedside, sent for her children to take a last farewell of Napoleon. The scene which ensued was affecting, the children ran to the bed, kissed the hands of Napoleon, and covered them with tears. One of the children fainted, and all had to be carried from the spot. We all, says Antomarchi, mixed our lamentations with theirs, we all felt the same anguish, the same cruel foreboding of the approach of the fatal instant, which every minute accelerated. The favorite valet, Narvaez, who had been for some time very ill, when he heard of the state in which Napoleon was, caused himself to be carried downstairs, and entered the apartment in tears. He was with great difficulty prevailed upon to leave the room, he was in a delirious state, and he fancied his master was threatened with danger, and was calling upon him for assistance. He said he would not leave him but would fight and die for him. But Napoleon was now insensible to the tears of his servants, he had scarcely spoken for 2 days. Early in the morning he articulated a few broken sentences, among which the only words distinguishable were, tête d'armée, the last that ever left his lips, and which indicated the tenor of his fancies. The day passed in convulsive movements and low moanings, with occasionally a loud shriek, and the dismal scene closed just before 6 in the evening. A slight froth covered his lips, and he was no more. After he had been dead about 6 hours, Antomarchi had the body carefully washed and laid out on another bed. The executors then proceeded to examine 2 codicils which were directed to be opened immediately after the emperor's decease. The one related to the gratuities which he intended out of his private purse for the different individuals of his household, and to the alms which he wished to be distributed among the poor of St. Helena. The other contained his last wish that his ashes should repose on the banks of the Seine, in the midst of the French people whom he had loved so well. The executors notified this request to the governor, who stated that his orders were that the body was to remain on the island. On the next day, after taking a plaster cast of the face of Napoleon, Antomarchi proceeded to open the body in the presence of Sir Thomas Reed, some staff officers, and 8 medical men. The emperor had intended his hair, which was of a chestnut color, for presents to the different members of his family, and it was cut off and kept for this purpose. He had grown considerably thinner in person during the last few months. After his death his face and body were pale, but without alteration or anything of a cadaverous appearance. His physiognomy was fine, the eyes fast closed, and you would have said that the emperor was not dead, but in a profound sleep. His mouth retained its expression of sweetness, though one side was contracted into a bitter smile. Several scars were seen on his body. On opening it was found that the liver was not affected, but that there was that cancer of the stomach which he had himself suspected, and of which his father and 2 of his sisters died. This painful examination having been completed, Antomarchi took out the heart and placed it in a silver vase filled with spirits of wine. He then directed the valet de chambre to dress the body as he had been accustomed in the emperor's lifetime, with the grand cordon of the Legion of Honor across the breast, in the green uniform of a colonel of the chasseurs of the guard. Decorated with the orders of the Legion of Honor and of the Iron Crown, long boots with little spurs, finally, his 3-cornered hat. Thus habited, Napoleon was removed in the afternoon of the 6th out of the hall, into which the crowd rushed immediately. The linen which had been employed in the dissection of the body, though stained with blood, was eagerly seized, torn in pieces, and distributed among the bystanders. Napoleon lay in state in his little bedroom which had been converted into a funeral chamber. It was hung with black cloth brought from the town. This circumstance first apprised the inhabitants of his death. The corpse, which had not been embalmed, and which was of an extraordinary whiteness, was placed on one of the camp beds, surrounded with little white curtains, which served for a sarcophagus. The blue cloak which Napoleon had worn at the Battle of Marengo covered it. The feet and the hands were free, the sword on the left side, and a crucifix on the breast. At some distance was the silver vase containing the heart and stomach, which were not allowed to be removed. At the back of the head was an altar, where the priest in his stole and surplice recited the customary prayers. All the individuals of Napoleon's suite, officers and domestics, dressed in mourning, remained standing on the left. Dr. Arnott had been charged to see that no attempt was made to convey away the body. For some hours the crowd had besieged the doors, they were admitted, and beheld the inanimate remains of Napoleon in respectful silence. The officers of the 20th and 66th regiments were admitted first, then the others. The following day, the 7th, the throng was greater. Antomarchi was not allowed to take the heart of Napoleon to Europe with him. He deposited that and the stomach in 2 vases, filled with alcohol and hermetically sealed, in the corners of the coffin in which the corpse was laid. This was a shell of zinc lined with white satin, in which was a mattress furnished with a pillow. There not being room for the hat to remain on his head, it was placed at his feet, with some eagles, pieces of French money coined during his reign, a plate engraved with his arms, etc. The coffin was closed, carefully soldered up, and then fixed in another case of mahogany, which was enclosed in a third made of lead, which last was fastened in a fourth of mahogany, which was sealed up and fastened with screws. The coffin was exhibited in the same place as the body had been, and was also covered with the cloak that Napoleon had worn at the Battle of Marengo. The funeral was ordered for the morrow, May 8th, and the troops were to attend in the morning by break of day. This took place accordingly. The governor arrived first, the rear admiral soon after, and shortly all the authorities, civil and military, were assembled at Longwood. The day was fine, the people crowded the roads, music resounded from the heights. Never had spectacle so sad and solemn been witnessed in these remote regions. At 12:30 the grenadiers took hold of the coffin, lifted it with difficulty, and succeeded in removing it into the great walk in the garden, where the hearse awaited them. It was placed in the carriage, covered with a pall of violet-colored velvet, and with the cloak which the hero wore at Marengo. The emperor's household were in mourning. The cavalcade was arranged by order of the governor in the following manner: the Abbé Vignal in his sacerdotal robes, with young Henry Bertrand at his side, bearing an aspersorium. Doctors Arnott and Antomarchi, the persons entrusted with the superintendence of the hearse, drawn by 4 horses, led by grooms, and escorted by 12 grenadiers without arms, on each side. These last were to carry the coffin on their shoulders as soon as the ruggedness of the road prevented the hearse from advancing, young Napoleon Bertrand, and Marchand, both on foot, and by the side of the hearse. Counts Bertrand and Montholon on horseback close behind the hearse, a part of the household of the emperor. Countess Bertrand with her daughter Hortense, in a calash drawn by 2 horses led by hand by her domestics, who walked by the side of the precipice, the emperor's horse led by his piqueur Arcambaude, the officers of marine on horseback and on foot. The officers of the staff on horseback, the members of the council of the island in like manner, General Coffin and the Marquis Montchenu on horseback, the rear admiral and the governor on horseback, the inhabitants of the island. The train set out in this order from Longwood, passed by the barracks, and was met by the garrison, about 2,500 in number, drawn up on the left of the road as far as Hut's Gate. Military bands placed at different distances added still more, by the mournful airs which they played, to the striking solemnity of the occasion. When the train had passed, the troops followed and accompanied it to the burying place. The dragoons marched first. Then came the 20th Regiment of Infantry, the Marines, the 66th, the Volunteers of St. Helena, and lastly, the Company of Royal Artillery, with 15 pieces of cannon. Lady Lowe and her daughter were at the roadside at Hut's Gate, in an open carriage drawn by 2 horses. They were attended by some domestics in mourning, and followed the procession at a distance. The 15 pieces of artillery were ranged along the road, and the gunners were at their posts ready to fire. Having advanced about a quarter of a mile beyond Hut's Gate, the hearse stopped, the troops halted and drew up in line of battle by the roadside. The grenadiers then raised the coffin on their shoulders and bore it thus to the place of interment, by the new route which had been made on purpose on the declivity of the mountain. All the attendants alighted, the ladies descended from their carriages, and the procession followed the corpse without observing any regular order. Counts Bertrand and Montholon, Marchand and young Napoleon Bertrand, carried the 4 corners of the pall. The coffin was laid down at the side of the tomb, which was hung with black. Near were seen the cords and pulleys which were to lower it into the earth. The coffin was then uncovered, the Abbé Vignal repeated the usual prayers, and the body was let down into the grave with the feet to the east. The artillery then fired 3 salutes in succession of 15 discharges each. The admiral's vessel had fired during the procession 25-minute guns from time to time. A huge stone, which was to have been employed in the building of the new house of the emperor, was now used to close his grave, and was lowered till it rested on a strong stone wall so as not to touch the coffin. While the grave was closed, the crowd seized upon the willows, which the former presence of Napoleon had already rendered objects of veneration. Every one was ambitious to possess a branch or some leaves of these trees which were henceforth to shadow the tomb of this great man, and to preserve them as a precious relic of so memorable a scene. The governor and admiral endeavored to prevent this outrage, but in vain. The governor, however, surrounded the spot afterwards with a barricade, where he placed a guard to keep off all intruders. The tomb of the emperor was about a league from Longwood. It was of a quadrangular shape, wider at top than at bottom, the depth about 12 feet. The coffin was placed on 2 strong pieces of wood, and was detached in its whole circumference. The companions of Napoleon returned to France, and the island gradually resumed its former quiet state, while the willows weeping over the grave guarded the ashes of the man for whom Europe had been all too small. E-text editor's bookmarks. A sect cannot be destroyed by Cannonball's ability in making it be supposed that he really possessed talent. Absurdity of interfering with trifles admired him more for what he had the fortitude not to do, always proposing what he knew could not be honorably acceded to. An old man's blessing never yet harmed any one. Animated by an unlucky zeal buried for the purpose of being dug up. Calumny. Such powerful charms cause of war between the United States and England. Conquest can only be regarded as the genius of destruction. Demand everything that you may obtain nothing. Die young, and I shall have some consolatory reflection. Every time we go to war with them we teach them how to beat us. Every one cannot be an atheist who pleases. Go to England.